Chapter 740. You have to be honest. The team members who woke up from the shock looked at Sulu and said earnestly. Then, someone looked at the still confused little nurse Huang Li, who was the core of the matter, and asked hesitantly, "Does this count as cuckolding this young master?" Hearing the word cuckolding, Sulu had some thoughts and memories. He looked up at the sky and said softly, "Nonsense. How is this cuckolding? At most it's a black pot." Outside the quiet hall of mansion number 11, it seemed to be an open space, but in fact the sky was not exposed. The transparent membrane above the stone ground blocked the spring rain that fell on people's hair. The rain gently spread down in an arc, giving people a dreamy feeling. He sensed something and turned his head to look. He saw tonight's candidate for best male lead, that cold and gloomy plum blossom like the iron calculator family's seventh young master, walking through the main entrance of the mansion under the light of the rain. "Welcome back to the capital ring," Li Xiaotong said with a smile and patted Su Li's shoulder. He looked at the hall with a smile and asked, "All right, you know that a successful person like me, who makes hundreds of Federation coins per minute, has very little time. Who is the target of the face slapping?" Everyone walked into the hall. Sulu asked Huang Li to walk beside Li Xiaotong. He shook his head and said with emotion, "I hate face slapping the most. I don't know the people at the table inside, and I don't even know what kind of people they are. The Federation's morality is really crumbling." On this night, the spring breeze was not intoxicating, and the spring rain was soft and lingering. The people who could enter mansion number 11 were naturally rich and noble. Anyone who stood up from the table was probably a famous person in the capital's special district. Sulu and the others couldn't sense the doubtful and displeased looks cast by those people. They walked directly to the table in the hall. The chaotic footsteps and the barbaric smell of sweat still seeped out from the soldiers in civilian clothes seemed to be somewhat out of place with the atmosphere of the mansion. There were two men and a woman sitting at the table. They were wearing low-key but exquisitely made clothes. There was cold but exquisitely made food on their plates. The man and woman, who looked like siblings, had exquisite but proud and indifferent smiles on their faces. The other man with slender fingers had a dignified appearance. On his wrist, he wore an exquisitely made but low-quality branded watch. The atmosphere of a gathering was disturbed by a group of unexpected guests, so they frowned in displeasure as they turned their heads. When the man with slender fingers saw Huang Li being pushed to the front by Sulu and the others, a trace of surprise flashed through his eyes before he quickly calmed down. There was even a trace of a gentle smile hanging on the corner of his lips, giving off a very comfortable feeling. "Is this Dr. Zhang Rui?" Li Xiaotong gently held Huang Li's waist and looked at the man expressionlessly. His indifferent eyes glanced at the man's face and then moved to his slender fingers. He seemed to be very careless. His palm gently stroked the girl's waist to declare his sovereignty. Zhang Rui, the young chief surgeon of the Department of Cardiac Surgery in the Army General Hospital with the most promising prospects, looked at the scene in front of him and roughly understood what was going on. He gave an apologetic smile to his new girlfriend and her brother, whom she could not offend. He gently wiped the corner of his mouth and stood up. He looked at Huang Li with a sigh and said earnestly, "Huang Li, we are already in the past. Why can't you let it go? It's your freedom to like me, but it's also my freedom to like whoever I like. You are still young and you still have a long life ahead of you. Can you not spend your energy on such a boring trick?" He looked at Li Xiaotong, reached out his hand and said gently, "Hello? I think you may be Huang Li's current boyfriend. I can probably understand why she brought you here. This is definitely not a chance encounter, but a deliberate show-off. However, the problem is that we are men. There is no need to fight for personal feelings, right?" Li Xiaotong frowned. Of course he would not shake hands with him. Dr. Zhang Rui was not angry. He smiled, turned to look at Huang Li, and continued to educate her in a very hidden and condescending tone. "Don't do this in the future. Do you think you can hurt my self-esteem because your current boyfriend can bring you to number 11 mansion? This is really childish. It will only make me feel that you are rude in front of your friends." From the beginning to now, it was basically Dr. Zhang Rui's performance. The girl who came from a famous family opposite the table had a faint mocking smile on her face. She did not even look at Huang Li, who was nervously twisting her fingers. They were not from the same world, so naturally, She was even stingy to show her anger. Su Lu and the others did not speak, because they were shocked by Dr. Zhang's words. What a sincere and proud man. What a righteous and awe-inspiring man. What a righteous and awe-inspiring man. Li Xiaotong seemed to have not expected this doctor to be such a person. His cold expression was somewhat relaxed. He looked at the other man who was still sitting in the chair, and felt that he seemed to have seen him somewhere. He could not help but frown and ask, "My name is Li Xiaotong. Have I seen you somewhere before?" With his identity as the second successor of the Li family, no matter what kind of social situation he was in, there was no need for him to introduce himself first. However, today he was invited by Su Lu to slap his face, so he had to lower his status and say his name lightly. He hoped that the rich young master would be sensible enough to retreat and not affect Su Li's rare mood of slapping his face. Unexpectedly, after hearing Li Xiaotong's words, the brother and sister did not respond. The man in the light cyan embroidered formal suit slightly frowned, glanced at Li Xiaotong and said, "I don't think we have met before." There was a moment of silence. Su Lu looked down at his shoes and said in a low voice, "There is actually someone who doesn't know you? Do you think I should know who you are?" The man in the light cyan formal suit showed a mocking expression on his face and said, "I know all the people I should know. But why should I know someone I shouldn't know?" Li Xiaotong's expression did not change, but the team members behind him gasped. Su Lu widened his small eyes and said with emotion, "We are here to slap his face. Why does it seem that we have been slapped in the face?" Li Xiaotong looked at him with a wry smile and said, "He doesn't even know me. How do you think we can slap his face?" Su Lu understood what he meant. It was probably the feeling of casting pearls before swine. He shook his head and said, "Today's arrangement is my fault. The level of the food chain is too far apart, so there is no deterrent effect. A lion catches a rabbit, and the rabbit eats the carrot. The rabbit is afraid of the lion, but the carrot doesn't know the lion at all. That's the truth." Li Xiaotong loosened his hand from Huang Li's waist and spread his hands, saying, "You can't think that a random cat or dog can recognize me." When they were talking, they didn't even look at Dr. Zhang Rui and the brother and sister who claimed to be from a famous family. In their eyes, these words were just a very common discussion, and they didn't care about them at all. Especially in the ears of the man in the light cyan formal suit, it was an absolute provocation and ridicule. Number 11 Mansion was not an ordinary club, and the man in the light cyan formal suit was also a very important person. He didn't want to argue with Su Lu and the others. He waved his hand to call the manager on duty, who had been standing not far away, and said coldly, "What's going on? These guests all have electronic invitations." The mansion had already checked, and the manager said awkwardly, "Young Master Chan, since they have disturbed your meal, I will inform the security department to ask them to leave as soon as you ask." With the subtle gesture of the manager, the security guards in black formal suits in the corner of the restaurant surrounded them with white headphones. The place where the rich live is really interesting. Do you think you can pretend to be a member of the special task force by wearing white headphones? But when it comes to violence, we are very good at this kind of thing. Xiong Linquan suddenly interjected, and then took off his windbreaker. The expressions of the three people at the table, the manager of number 11 Mansion, and the security guards changed dramatically. They were shocked to see the cold guns in the man's windbreaker, and their hands and feet suddenly froze. The Federation strictly controlled guns, and even the most famous underworld boss Zhang Xiaohua in Nankashao didn't dare to show so many guns in a place like the mansion. So, there was only one explanation for the scene in front of them. The condescending look on the face of the young master surnamed Chan finally dissipated slowly. He put the napkin on the table and stared at the people in front of him. Finally, his eyes fell on Su Li's face, and he was shocked to recognize his identity. "Sorry for the disrespect. You are actually a hero of the Federation." Young Master Chen's lips were a little pale, but he still smiled and said, "I have heard some legends about you, but I really didn't expect to see you in such a jealous situation. My name is Chan Shanglin. Zhang Rui and my sister are engaged, so I can call him brother-in-law." "Colonel Su Lu, I don't know what relationship you have with my brother-in-law's ex-girlfriend, but I think that even if you are a hero of the Federation, there is no reason for you to get involved in these emotional issues. Chen Shanglin was born in an extraordinary family, and he was a genius in the financial field. He had made a lot of achievements in the stock market when he was over 30 years old. After he set up a company, he was even described by financial magazines as a candidate for the future S1 business leader. Because of all these, he had developed a proud and unyielding personality. So, at this moment, even if he knew who was standing in front of him, he didn't have the slightest intention of backing down. When it came to the philosophical relationship between face-slapping and face-slapping, as well as the face of the Chun family, he really couldn't back down. He didn't want to be outdone and said, "Even if you are from the army, I think you should behave yourself here. Ordinary people may not know, but you should have heard of the 7 great families." Young Master Chun stared into Su Li's eyes and said, "Number 11 mansion is one of the properties of one of the families. How can you be so presumptuous? Besides, you are not very lucky. That young master happened to be here today." There was a strange silence. The members of Group 7, who had followed Su Lu into the manor of the Lin family, stared at this young master, not knowing what to say. Li Xiaotong shook his head, looked at Su Lu and said, "It seems that he is not very clear about the things you have done." "I am not as impulsive as before," Su Lu explained seriously. The restaurant of mansion number 11 was cleared out. The black-clothed security guards were holding folding taser batons and vigilantly looking at the people around the table. Not long after, the owner behind the scenes of the mansion finally appeared. And as soon as he appeared, it was 2 people. When Chen Xianglin saw the 2 young people, the indifference and pride on his face suddenly turned into kindness and gentleness, and there was even a hint of flattery on his face. When he saw the other person, his mood became extremely relaxed. With his status, he was able to get acquainted with the owner behind the scenes of this mansion mainly because of the accidental introduction of that distant relative. Since that distant relative was also here today, there was even less to worry about. His sister beside him looked over there and shouted with a smile, "Cousin." Dr. Zhang Rui looked at the scene in disbelief. He had never imagined that the Chun siblings, who were extremely arrogant and bossy in front of him, would have such a side to them. He was sensitive to the fact that the owner behind mansion number 13 should be a big shot with a very high status. However, he didn't know the distribution of the 7 legendary families, so he couldn't guess the identity of the 2 people, but his heart was also burning with passion. Looking at the 2 people, Li Xiaotong's expression became a little strange, while Su Lu tilted his head and looked over there as if he was looking at a clown, squinting his eyes. The Chun siblings and Dr. Zhang Rui went forward to greet them. They were about to say a few words to express their apologies for disturbing the mansion, and then take the opportunity to get closer to the 2 real young masters of aristocratic families. Unexpectedly, the 2 young masters didn't seem to see them at all and looked over there in astonishment. They also turned their heads and didn't know what happened there, but only saw Su Lu, Li Xiaotong, and others standing there calmly. Chen Xianglin was puzzled and said, "Cousin, 12th young master. 7th brother, why did you come in person?" The young master on the left opened his hands with an exaggerated expression and greeted Li Xiaotong. He said loudly, "I'm so excited and uneasy that you came in person to eat in such a shabby place." "Cousin, what did 12th young master just say?" Miss Chun asked with some confusion. The 7th brother of 12th young master is naturally 7th young master Li. The young master who was called cousin looked over there nervously and roared in a hoarse and angry voice, "You 2 idiots, how did you offend them?" Li Xiaotong? Chen Xianglin's face suddenly turned pale. 3 years ago, he should have seen this legendary 7th young master Li in a top nightclub with his grumpy distant cousin. But why didn't he think of it today? Why didn't he realize it even after Li Xiaotong told him his name? A young business leader? A genius in the financial world? Li Xiaotong was the 2nd successor of the Li family. He didn't need to do anything at all. He only needed to look at him, and his life would be ruined completely. I know all the people I should know, but why should I know the people I shouldn't know? Suddenly, he thought of the words he had said earlier. At that time he felt that his words were very powerful. Now he understood what the other party meant by Tom, Dick and Harry. He realized that his words were just a slap to his own face. It was a very powerful slap. Li Xiaotong didn't know that this mansion was an inconspicuous property of the Li family, and he didn't know how to answer this distant cousin's enthusiastic and exaggerated greeting. Although he had a high status in the hearts of the elders of the family, he definitely deserved this kind of enthusiasm and even flattery. However, he didn't know how to answer this question, so he just kept silent with a sullen face. A direct descendant of one of the 7 great families who had the right of succession had pretended to be the boyfriend of a commoner girl and played a childish game of face-slapping. Moreover, that commoner girl had a few dazzling freckles. Had such a thing ever happened in history? Li Xiaotong was scared by his silence and didn't dare to ask more questions. However, he instantly found the existence of Su Lu, so he started to greet him even more enthusiastically and exaggeratedly. For a young master who was raised by a family like the House of Prophet, sometimes he would be a playboy, sometimes he would be shameless, but most of the time he would show the extreme characteristics of a successful businessman. Just look at the enthusiasm of this 12th young master towards the members of Group 7. After a few short conversations, he knew the purpose of Li Xiaotong and Su Li's visit to number 11 mansion today. Although he didn't think it was a big deal, his face darkened without hesitation. He walked to the Chan siblings and Dr. Zhang Rui and stared at them without saying a word. Under such strong pressure, Chan Xianglin began to sweat. However, he was a successful person with shrewdness and courage. He pursed his lips and his forehead was full of sweat, but he refused to lower his head. He said to the man beside him, "Cousin, although this is a young man's emotional problem, it is a family matter after all." In his opinion, as long as his cousin was willing to stand up for him, then even the terrifying iron schemer would give him some face. Sure enough, Li Xiaotong looked at them silently for a moment and said to Su Lu next to him, "You know that the relationship between our 2 families has always been very good. It is not convenient for me to do anything." Su Lu looked down at the shoes on his feet, as if he was recalling the feeling of stepping on the beach. He suddenly raised his head, stared at the cousin who was regarded as the strongest supporter by the Chun siblings and Dr. Zhang Rui, and asked seriously, "There was a very clear clause in the agreement between your brother and me. As long as I am still alive, you can't step into S1. I want to know, where are your feet now?" There was silence. The Chun siblings and Dr. Zhang Rui were shocked to hear so much from this sentence, especially Child Chun. Only now did he know that the reputation of the 7 families didn't seem to be very useful in front of Su Lu. Even that colonel seemed to have done something before. Cousin Lin Daohai took a deep breath, forcibly suppressed the humiliation and anger in his heart, and said angrily, "I will go back to S3 right away, okay?" "Of course not, I want an explanation." Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at him. "Why are you in S1? What kind of person is Lin Banshan? How can he go back on his words? If he doesn't know how to discipline his brother, I don't mind disciplining him again." "Are you being reasonable? You are already a colonel, are you still being reasonable?" Lin Daohai waved his arms angrily and shouted, "Don't use Lin Banshan as an example. If you really dare to do anything to me, just kill me." As soon as the words came out, Lin Daohai's voice suddenly stopped. The bloody and humiliating experience in the past few years made him understand that a terrifying human like Su Lu was not a target he could deal with. What was even more annoying was that this guy really dared to kill him. Thinking of this, his momentum softened, and he explained in a low voice, "After you were taken captive to the Empire, the entire Federation thought you were dead. I thought the agreement would naturally be cancelled, so I went back to S1. Your explanation makes sense, but now you already know that I am still alive," Su Lu reminded him. "I will go right away, directly to S3. Lin Daohai gave him a hateful look, turned around and walked out of the mansion without saying anything. He didn't say anything to Li Xiaotong, didn't say a word to anyone, and left in a very straightforward manner. The Chun siblings had always thought that the Lin family, one of the 7 great families, was their most solid support in the Federation. This feeling was probably similar to what Su Lu thought when he saw the old man in the military prison of Qingcheng. The problem was that until the old man died, no one dared to touch him, but Su Lu had never been afraid to confront the authority of the 7 great families, and in the past, he had won. Today, Lin Daohai left in a huff, which was the aftermath of his past achievements. Chan Xianglin, who had lost all hope, glanced at Li Xiaotong, who was drinking at the bar in the distance with a pale face, and said with a nervous smile, "I think this Miss Huang is not the girlfriend of the 7th young master Li." You all came here specifically to slap my face, but I don't understand why. I know myself, although I have some status in the industry, I am definitely not qualified to be slapped in the face like this. Actually, I don't understand why this happened either. Sulu shrugged and said, it's probably all Mr. Sher's fault. Of course, they didn't know who Mr. Sher was, let alone know that he had anything to do with the story that happened in the rainy night. Sulu turned to look at Miss Chan, who was in a daze, and said expressionlessly, cancel the engagement. Miss Chan was shocked, but Chan Xianglin said without hesitation, okay? Suli's voice became gentler, and he looked at Miss Chan and said, Miss, don't be with this kind of man in the future. Okay. As usual, Chan Xianglin quickly agreed. Then, under Suli's gaze, he pulled his sister out of the restaurant. Miss Chan sadly turned around and looked at her former fiancé. She pleaded with a trembling voice, don't kill him. Getting married to a prestigious family, being sponsored to become one of the best doctors in the Federation, and having a meteoric rise in the Federation, all of these had turned into bubbles in an instant. The dignified Dr. Jiang Rui's face was pale, as if he had lost his soul. He raised his head and stared at Nurse Huangli, who had been silent all this time, and shouted in a shrill voice, are you satisfied now? What did I do wrong to you? How can you treat me like this? What do you want to do? Then he looked at Sulu and the others and shouted angrily, you are all real big shots. Why do you have to make things difficult for a poor doctor like me? I just want to live a better life. Is that wrong? As I said, it's all Mr. Sher's fault. Sulu paused for a moment, looked at him and frowned. But it's not a glorious thing to abandon someone. And I hate men like you the most. You're wrong, but you always think you're right. What's wrong with you? Maybe it was because he thought of his messy love life, but his mood suddenly became very bad. He took a cigarette from Xiong Linquan and lit it. I'm a man. Don't you think you can force me to give up my love in this way? Dr. Jiang Rui's eyes were bloodshot. He waved his arms and looked at Huang Li with hatred. Even if I die, I won't marry you. I don't know if you're acting to prove that you're loyal to love so that we can let Huang Li marry you, so that you can get to know us and the seventh young master of the Li family. After a long speech, Sulu almost coughed. He casually pointed at Dr. Zhang's nose with the finger that was holding the cigarette and said, if that's the case, your acting skills are not bad. But don't worry, even if Nurse Huang is really stupid and crazy enough to fall in love with you again, we will not allow this to happen. He put the cigarette in his mouth and took a deep breath. He looked down at the second letter on the screen of his phone and read it calmly. After the face-slapping of the freckled beauty's ex-boyfriend is over, he is not allowed to fall in love for 5 years. He is not allowed to visit prostitutes and can only use guns. Sulu raised his head and looked at Dr. Jiang Rui, who had a look of disbelief on his face, and explained, as I said, everything is Mr. Sher's fault. As for these specific measures, they are all his instructions in his will. I have to practice them one by one. Huang Li, who was behind him, burst out laughing. Don't try to fall in love or visit prostitutes behind our backs, Sulu kindly reminded him. You've seen the documentary that won the Nebula Award, right? We're a very professional team. From today on, your life will be full of eavesdropping and remote peeping. Once you violate the rules, I can't guarantee what will happen. That's too much. Dr. Jiang Rui lowered his head and said in pain, even if I've made mistakes, you've gone too far. How can you be so unreasonable? Reasonable? My teacher said that there is no such thing as reason in this universe. Sulu said calmly. After a slight pause, he suddenly raised his voice and sounded particularly angry. If it was reasonable, why would that guy lie on the car and never wake up? Then it was Huang Li's turn to speak. She sobbed to her ex-boyfriend, Dr. Jiang Rui, and said, although you didn't mess with me, and I don't think that a breakup means being abandoned, I can't accept the way we broke up. I can't accept the vicious words you said to get rid of me as quickly as possible. I'm not a clingy person, but since you made me unhappy, I'm going to pester you and make you unhappy too. She raised her head and stared at her ex-boyfriend's face. Bravely, she cried, I've been buying lunch for you for 7 months, and washing your socks and underwear for 6 months. You owe me all that and I want to take it back. A series of crisp slaps sounded. Huang Li clearly slapped her ex-boyfriend 6 times on the left side of his face and 7 times on the right side of his face. Although she didn't use much strength, she still slapped Dr. Zhang's face until it was red and swollen. It was beautiful. Huang Li wiped away her tears with her reddened palms. She bowed deeply to Su Lu and the members of Group 7. Then she said, "Then I'll be leaving." Li Xiaotong, who was drinking at the bar, saw this scene. His hand that was holding the wine glass slightly froze. Looking at this girl with freckles, he felt that she looked like a person. No, it should be said that her temperament was very similar to a person. She had a piercingly cold aura that was rarely seen in girls. The team members applauded the girl enthusiastically. Only now did they realize that under the gentle and kind appearance of this young nurse hid such a strong heart. It was no wonder that Shi Qinghai had such a bizarre story before his death, and still couldn't forget this chance encounter after his death. Hooligan. Su Lu smiled and said to the beautiful man in the black freezer in the carriage outside the mansion, "I've done what you asked me to do. You can close your peach blossom eyes now. Then, I should go and do the rest of our business." Chapter 741. The misty rain on a spring night would disturb one's dreams, so it was not a good time to fall into a dark and sweet dream. Furthermore, Su Lu and the others still had a lot of important matters to attend to, so they occupied the 11th mansion and began to drink. The 12th young master of the Li family enthusiastically accompanied them for a few drinks, then tactfully left in advance. At this time, Su Lu saw Brother Zeng beside Li Xiaotong. He respected Brother Zeng, who was like a spear, so he went up to him and greeted him. Brother Zeng nodded. He still waited silently behind 7th young master Li like before, but there were a few specks of white on his sideburns. Li Xiaotong looked at this scene and couldn't help but sigh. In the Federation, only Su Lu was more polite and serious when he saw his bodyguards. It was probably because of this personality that many people admired Su Lu, such as the president. Then, there were even more people who wanted Su Lu dead, such as the big shots in the government and the military. Li Xiaotong poured the remaining wine into the ashtray to extinguish the cigarette. He frowned and said, "No one wants you to come back to the capital ring at this time." Su Lu raised his glass and clinked it with the team members in the distance. He took 2 sips and replied vaguely with the cigarette in his mouth, "Many people have expressed similar intentions." Li Xiaotong shook his head and said, "Everyone knows why you were exiled to the West Woods. They can roughly guess why Mr. Shi did what he did. Now that Mr. Byron is dead, he's dead, and the investigation on the ancient clock hasn't been restarted. Now that you're back." His eyebrows were like the branches of a plum blossom that had been frozen in the snow. He frowned slightly. "Everyone is scared. They are worried that you will go crazy like you did when you killed Macklin. Even the old man in my family has touched the round hat more often than before. It is obvious that he is anxious about your return." In the end, no one expected that other than going to the police station on this rainy night, you actually didn't do anything else. Instead, you spent a lot of energy fighting for that woman's affection. This matter is really puzzling. It's mainly to satisfy Shi Qinghai's craving. Su Lu looked at him and said with a smile, "It's really embarrassing for you to do this personally." Li Xiaotong shook his head and said with a self-deprecating smile, "As long as you don't go crazy, even if you ask me to take off my clothes and act as a clown, I'm willing to do it, let alone play a boring face-slapping scene for you. Is it that bad?" Su Lu frowned and found it funny. "You're the biggest investment in my life." Li Xiaotong looked at him solemnly and said slowly, "The past few years have proven that the elders in my family have long accepted that no matter if you are a soldier or a felon locked up in Qingcheng, as long as you don't die, my investment will definitely benefit. Therefore, I sincerely hope that you will learn to control your anger and learn to cherish your own body. In my eyes, your life is much more precious than other people's." In anyone's eyes, their own life was definitely the most precious thing in the universe. However, because the law of nature had already cast the spell that all living things would wither, people had to accept it sadly, and then try to find a way to leave with more happiness. For example, they could find a reason that was more emotional than death, or they could die on the path they freely chose. Last night, under the lingering spring rain, Su Lu and his comrades had quietly chosen a grave for the guy in the car to rest in. It was early in the morning, and this was the Xinghe Public Cemetery. Sulu put the white bouquet in his hand in front of Professor Shan's grave, and then walked to the tombstone next to it. Looking at the rain-soaked handwriting on the tombstone, he smiled slightly. Shi Qinghai's family background and a brief description were written on the tombstone. The epitaph was chosen by Sulu. It was a very powerful sentence picked out from the letter many years ago. These words were sonorous and powerful, but they were not blindly serious, which was very much like Mr. Shi's character. I have already died on the path I chose, but you have to live well, and live with a clear conscience. Back then, when Sulu had read the letter Shi Qinghai had left behind in the restaurant, he had seen the line about choosing his own path. He had come to a realization. If a person could die on the path they had chosen, it would be a kind of peaceful happiness. So today, he had engraved this line of words on the other person's tombstone. Artistic young people generally have short lives. Holding a black umbrella and holding her son's hand, Zhou stood in the cold rain and looked at the grave in front of her with a mocking expression on her face. Zhou Liuhua, who was already 4 or 5 years old, opened his big black eyes curiously and looked at the cement mound in front of him. Of course, he didn't know that the person lying in the mound was his father, but he was very unhappy that his mother's hand was so cold and hard that it hurt a little. Little boys were as dangerous and flustered as animals, but they also had some kind of sensitive perception ability. According to his usual character, Zhou Liuhua should have already made a big fuss, but when he felt the strange atmosphere in the cemetery garden and the pain from his hand, he didn't make a sound. Sulu glanced at Zhou Yu and found that she still had a small red flower in her hair today. He didn't know what material it was made of, but the bright red petals were stained with the powder scattered by the spring rain, making them look bright and beautiful. He didn't know when it started. Perhaps it was because of the pain of her dream being shattered, and Mou crying on the highway, but after she matured very quickly, Zhou Yu, in addition to liking to wear red clothes, also fell in love with red flowers. Although until the end you didn't get together again. Sulu spread out his hands and said, "But I thought that on this kind of occasion, you should at least change the color of the flower." Zhou Yu was silent for a long time. Although she was quiet, a smile suddenly flashed across her naturally charming face. She said, "He said that red flowers are beautiful." 5 years ago, in the same cemetery in the same rain, Sulu officially took the heavy responsibility of taking care of Zhou Yu and the child in her belly for Shi Qinghai. 5 years later, the little life in her belly had grown into a healthy little boy. Zhou Yu was still beautiful, Sulu was still carrying all kinds of pots, and Shi Qinghai was already sleeping underground. Time really did change a lot of things. "Liuhua is going to play the piano tonight. Let's have supper," she said. "Okay," Sulu replied. Zhou Yu took the child and turned to leave. She didn't hesitate, and it was extremely simple. Sulu looked at her back that disappeared in the spring rain. After a moment of silence, he made a phone call. In the rain, he lowered his voice and frowned, saying, "Mr. Hello, I'm Sulu." Chapter 742. In the early morning of late spring, the air that had been washed many times by last night's rain carried a fresh smell. It blew from the lawn in front of the official residence's terrace and blew on the girl's face. Miss Padil, the only daughter of the Federation president, was 14 years old this year. She was still thin, and her face was pale and serene, even a little too serene. She was wearing a white gauze dress today, hiding herself behind the curtain of the terrace, avoiding the vigilant special task force agents in front of the terrace. Her fingers tightly grasped the phone, and her slightly thick lips opened and closed many times before she said slowly with great difficulty and shyness to the other end of the phone, "Yes. Lieutenant Colonel Liu, father, is ready to go out. You want to meet him? Okay, I understand what you mean." The first daughter of the Federation, who had been autistic since childhood and had slightly improved in recent years, chuckled after hearing Suli's promise on the phone. She probably thought that the orthodontic lines on her teeth were not good looking, so she quickly covered her mouth and nodded hard at the phone. Sulu did not have much personal contact with the president's residence. After all, the president of the Federation had a busy schedule and could not have much personal time. Mr. Pabre once mocked himself during a meal that the president of the Federation's body belonged to the Federation, not his wife. However, compared to the average person, Suli's relationship with the most powerful family in the Federation could be considered quite close. He had had dinner with that special family of 3 many times. As for Miss Padil, Sulu had relatively little contact with her. After all, a girl who had been troubled by autism needed special protection from her family. However, there were occasional letters, and he remembered to send a few small gifts. Just as this story had taken more than 2 million words to tell, and just as Shi Qinghai had praised it one year, Sulu, this small-eyed man, had become less and less talkative since he began to flee, but the special smell or charm on him had become stronger and stronger. Was that why so many girls in the Federation and even the Imperium thought that he was very trustworthy? Standing in the drizzle in Xinghe Public Cemetery, standing under the commemorative tree, Sulu lowered his voice and patiently explained something to the president's daughter on the other end of the phone. He explained something, made an agreement, and then promised something with a smile. After carefully exhorting her, he finally hung up the phone in relief. To the Southern Suburbs Division, Sulu said, the dark green motorcade left the cemetery along the winding mountain road, leaving behind 2 graves and 2 bouquets of flowers. Unbeknownst to them, the familiar black car without a logo had snuck into the convoy. At this time, Sulu was sitting in the back of the black car. Through the infantry team's field command system, he was giving orders to the team members in the front and back of the military vehicles. 3 high points. Mark out the precise shooting angles. He pulled out the scroll screen in front of his phone and stared at the high-precision map on the screen with narrowed eyes. He used his finger to tap on a few hidden spots on the map. There are people from the other side here. Gu Shifeng, who was sitting beside him, flicked her round fingers and quickly marked out the coordinates. Then, she entered the team's operation target into the workbench. After thinking for a while, she added a sentence into the comm system. The other side is an expert from the army. What we need to do is control. Be careful. At this time, they were preparing to go to the 17th Division's base in the southern suburbs. After all, Sulu was a soldier of the Federation. He had disobeyed orders and returned to the capital ring. Yesterday, he had spent the rainy night mourning and burying his friends. Now he had to report back to his own unit. Under the overpass on Highway 3 here. This is the temporary military training base of the capital garrison's Mecha Brigade. The problem is that 2 mechas were moved to the base yesterday, but they haven't been warmed up yet. Sulu drew a circle on a certain spot on the screen and then heavily tapped on it. I'll go and watch them myself, Gu Shifeng quickly replied. When they're warmed up, I'll do a waveband overlap. There's a 70% chance that they'll wedge into the cores of those 2 mechas. The fleet drove quietly on the smooth roads in the suburbs of the capital. Other than the clear and short replies from Sulu and his team members, there was only silence in the command system. Occasionally, there would be a minute of silence. This caused the fleet to have a very complicated feeling. Yesterday, when they received Sulu at the Old Moon base, Team 7 had been vigilantly observing their surroundings. Although there was no actual danger, with so many Federation government departments following them at Charter Square and the cautiousness of their boss, they knew that the seemingly peaceful road ahead was actually filled with storms. They just didn't know when they would roll up or calm down. Gu Shifeng, who used an extremely short amount of time to complete the electronic signal conversion and synchronization channel setup, suddenly raised her head and asked, "Boss, this is the capital special district after all. Do you really think that those people would dare to go against you so openly? No matter what, you're still the successor personally chosen by the war god." It was very quiet in the black car. Sulu lowered his head in silence, thinking about how to answer this question. In order to prevent him from returning to the capital ring and uncovering the truth, those people were not stingy with physical destruction. In order to achieve their goal, they had even inconceivably mobilized the battleships of the Federal Fleet. They were already so crazy that they naturally wouldn't care that this was the capital special district and that the war god cared about him. Furthermore, the war god was already dead and buried in Philadelphia. And that person's relationship with the war god was much closer than his own. Those people really want me dead. He looked at the scrolling information on the screen and explained, but you don't have to worry too much. The key is to control the sniping position. Once that is controlled, they won't be able to do anything. Speaking up to this point, he raised his head and said to Gu Shifeng, "Remove that mecha backup station from the safety list. You don't have to deal with it personally." Gu Shifeng didn't quite understand. In the front row of the black car sat the two people with the best driving skills of Group 7, Lu Jiao and Da Vinci. Da Vinci suddenly frowned and asked, "Boss, what if the other party uses a powerful weapon? You have to know that no one dares to underestimate your freakish combat ability. Normal combat units can't even break through our defense, so how can they hurt you?" Sulu couldn't explain this point. Now, he was covered in a faint layer of the glory of the charter. Any large-scale weapon that required chip control and could receive long-range signals, such as powerful military mechas and fighter jets, or even those giant Federation battleships, could no longer threaten his safety. The more powerful and terrifying a military machine was, the more likely it was to be turned into a pile of scrap metal in front of him. Just like what had happened in that space when his life was in danger as far as his eyes could see, and as far as his fingertips could reach, there would be only peace. In a sense, with the support of the glory of the charter, he was a passive and omnipotent god. Unfortunately, gods weren't omnipotent. Sulu couldn't control the human body in simple, primitive, and never outdated killing weapons like guns. This point just happened to prove Uncle Feng Yu's theory. The simplest was the most powerful. In order to survive in this special capital city full of hidden chaos and killing intent, as well as to obtain the final victory, Sulu needed the help of the members of Group 7. Moreover, he was confident that with the help of these 20 or so members, he could accurately eliminate all the dangerous factors ahead of him. This was the question that Gu Shifeng had hidden in the deepest part of her heart all this time. Only now did she ask, "Boss, the accuracy of your information is too terrifying." He used his chubby finger to quickly and nervously point at the accurately marked sniper positions on the electronic map. Looking at the detailed annotations, including the production date of the sniper's equipment, he could not hide his shock and said, "Just like last night in Charter Square. Where did you get this information? If you can get such amazing information every time you fight a battle, then what's the point of the enemy?" Sulu scratched his head. After a moment of silence, he smiled and explained, "Well, I have someone up there." "Someone up there? Who is it?" Gu Shifeng and Da Vinci in the front row raised their heads at the same time and stared at the flat roof of the black car. They wanted to see through the hard bulletproof material and see the mysterious, powerful and terrifying information provider. After the reorganization of the new 17th Division, they naturally couldn't stay in the Harbor City Garrison Guard District. They were directly transferred back to the southern suburbs of the special capital city. Only the black car that Sulu was in and a dark green military vehicle that was leading the way had arrived at the southern suburbs. The rest of the vehicles and the swift and fierce soldiers were nowhere to be found. Division Commander Yu Chonghai was sick and was admitted to the Army General Hospital. He was about to be transferred to a military hospital in the southern hemisphere, so Sulu didn't see the old soldier that he wanted to see the most and respected the most. The black car quietly drove out of the gate of the new 17th Division like a ghost. Sulu sat by the window and silently looked at the clear map of the military forces around the special capital city. His mood became slightly heavier. The permanent troops in the capital city garrison were 4 special-class divisions. Most of them were from the 1st Military Region, and that didn't include the new 17th Division and the Iron 7th Division. If Division Commander Yu Chonghai was really sick, then the new 17th Division would definitely be greatly affected. Who was the one who made the law in the 1st Military Region? Who transferred all the troops loyal to the Zhong family from the Westwoods Military Region to the Empire's front line? Who made the Iron 7th Division not return to S3 but forcefully stay beside the special capital city? Thinking of the name of that general, Sulu was silent. Then he frowned and felt a pain in his forehead. Then a thunderous sound suddenly sounded in his ears. Bang! A bullet from a sniper rifle came out of nowhere and accurately hit the window of the black car, right next to Sulu's cheek, and a flower of pain burst out of the window. If it weren't for the strong protection of the Qianshi Tai family's black car, this shot would definitely have blown his head into a pile of bloody mud. Sulu turned his head and looked at the terrifying Dan Hen in front of him. His eyelashes didn't even blink. After a moment of silence, as if nothing had happened, he lowered his head and continued reading. Chapter 743. Then came the second shot. This bullet hit the original bullet mark with exceptional precision. The deviation was so small that it was negligible. An astonishing muffled sound rang out, and the window that looked like it was blooming like a flower petal started to waver again. In the spring breeze it looked like it was drifting, but in fact there was no substantial damage. Judging from the sound of the bullet exploding and the smooth movement of the heavy black car on the road, the sniper should be using a light anti-material long-range firearm. This type of firearm could directly penetrate the side armor of the Federation military armored vehicle. The accuracy of the 2 consecutive shots also fully demonstrated the exceptional military skills of the sniper. However, this time Sulu didn't even bother to turn his head to look. He looked at the screen thoughtfully, as if he didn't feel anything. He was as calm as the wind and clouds, like a damned artistic youth who was quietly reading in the midst of a sky full of bullets. The terrifying bullets heavily knocked against the window beside his face, but he was so calm. It definitely wasn't because he needed to act calm in this situation to win the excited screams and cheers of the girls, nor was it because he had the thickest nerves in the universe, even thicker than White Sauschers. It was because as the best of the best engineers, under the premise of having a plan in place, rational analysis and deduction gave him enough calmness to face all of this. He didn't want to see a shooting scene that would shock the Federation on the streets of the southern suburbs of the capital special district. Therefore, after splitting into 2 groups, Team 7 quietly bypassed the snipers on the rooftops of most of the buildings. As for the sniper on the southeast side of the 6-story residential building, Team 7 had already been monitoring him. As for the possible damage this sniper could cause, Sulu firmly believed that the light, long-range anti-material gun could penetrate the side armor of the armored vehicle, but it definitely couldn't penetrate the black car he was in. Years ago in the underground parking lot of the Lin High State Gymnasium, the Federation's M52 Mecha's 6-barrel Darlin's autocannon fired wildly at close range. The Thai family's specially made black car seemed to be hopping up and down miserably, struggling and whining. However, in the end, Butler Jean gently stepped on the gas pedal, and the black car was still full of power and escaped with the skinny crown prince. What's more, he was enduring a long-range attack today. The effect of these 2 shots was at most like a tree branch poking at a bison's body, making it itchy and restless, but they couldn't pierce through that layer of solid skin. Xiong Lin Quan, who was hiding on the hill, silently pulled the trigger. Through the optical scope, he could clearly see a plume of smoke rising from the corner of the top floor of the 6-story residential building. He couldn't see the person's movement, but he knew that he had succeeded. He quickly tore off his camouflage and rushed to the military vehicle that was waiting at the bottom of the hill. At the top of the residential building's balcony, the military sniper wearing a dark green stealth windbreaker leaned against the wall. He held the bullet wound on his left shoulder and breathed heavily. Blood kept flowing out from between his fingers as he stared at the beautiful bullet point on the opposite wall. His face was very pale. The wooden door in front of the balcony was kicked open, and 3 members of Group 7 rushed in at high speed. Their triangular formation was flawless, and they found their targets in the shortest amount of time possible. Furthermore, they used the black muzzle of their guns to announce the victory of this ambush. A member of Group 7 named Shi Hang looked at the sniper in the corner who was trying to take out a military knife. His finger quickly pressed the button on the flashlight and advised in a low voice, "Brother, there are no casualties on either side right now. Don't make things too difficult." The sniper quieted down. He held his left shoulder and stared at the dark green windbreaker that was getting redder and redder. He stood up with great difficulty and made a decisive decision. He looked at the 3 members of Group 7 and smiled apologetically. His body suddenly leaned back, and just like that, he flipped over the wall and jumped down. He reached the top of the 6-story building in an instant. His body landed heavily on the ground, making a muffled cracking sound. All the blood in his body that was wrapped in the dark green windbreaker seemed to have gushed out in an instant. The cold concrete floor was like an oil painting, and the flowers in the painting were as red and as beautiful as the flowers in the painting that in the back of the black car. Gu Shifeng stared at the electronic monitoring map on the screen of the workbench and listened to the reports of the various groups. His chubby fingers kept sliding and swiping across the screen, and his slightly furrowed brows showed the anxiety and uneasiness in his heart. We didn't manage to capture him alive. He took off his headphones and looked at Sulu beside him. He said in a low voice, "I checked the body of the one who jumped off the building. The proportion of rust on his body was too high. I hacked into the Coastal Defense Team's database to do a comparison. This sniper is from the Sea Wolves Special Forces. Sulu was not surprised. He narrowed his eyes and looked through the popped flower on the window. He looked at the green forest that quickly passed by the side of the road and seriously considered the situation he was facing. Mr. Sure killed his way into Parliament Hill. Many people on the list died and many were injured. He originally thought that there was not much left for him to do, but when he found out that the general was actually the most powerful and hidden hand, he realized that he had still underestimated his opponent's strength. Because of the existence of the general, the federal military had naturally formed a thick wall. This wall was trying to suffocate him and bury him directly in the ruins of history. Even if they could not do this for the time being, they had successfully blocked him from the official residence. Unless President Pabre did not want to see him, it would be very difficult to explain the problems that had happened in the past few days. However, this situation was impossible. There are a few locations that I need to pay attention to in the Department of National Defense building. I don't want to be the first colonel of the Federation to have his head blown off when he walks out of the building. After a moment of silence, Sulu calmed down. He pointed at a building on the electronic map and said to Gu Shifeng with a smile, "You don't have to deal with the locations A and B. Those are the department's daily sniping and surveillance points. Also, remind De Xiong and the others to be careful and not cause any misunderstandings." The secretary tactfully left the minister's office after making the tea. Ever since Secretary Jiao committed suicide due to treason, the Secretariat of the Department of National Defense was very careful about this. Minister of National Defense Zhou Yingxing took off his metal-rimmed glasses and gently rubbed his forehead. He did not hide his tiredness in front of Sulu and said in a low voice, "Every action has a purpose. You violated military discipline and orders from your superiors, and forcibly returned to the capital ring from the West Woods. What's your purpose? Of course, it's not as simple as just collecting Shi Qinghai's body. I just received a report that there was a shooting incident in the residential area of Yanshisan in the southern suburbs. There was a large amount of firepower and firearms in the incident. Does this have anything to do with you? Someone in the military wants to kill me. When I came back from the West Woods, I encountered 3 battleships. They came from Quasi 355 base. In order to kill me, they did not hesitate to sacrifice the entire battleship I was on. As for the shooting incident you mentioned, I don't know if it's the aftermath or the beginning of a new story. What we found out now is that the sniper was from the Navy Special Forces. Sulu would not hide anything in front of Minister Zhou. On one hand, it was because he trusted this low-key and sincere Federation general. On the other hand, the conflict of interest between the two sides was too deep. It would be difficult for Zhou Yingxing to gain anything by betraying him. Quasi 355 base is very remote. The Federal fleet usually does not use their battleships. Zhou Yingxing said calmly, as for the Navy, which is in a semi-disbanded state, the management of its special forces is relatively lax. It is very difficult to find out anything. Also, you should know that even if I can find out, I can't. It had nothing to do with the balance of the overall situation. It was Zhou Yingxing's direct description. In the federal military system, there were 3 people who assisted the president in defense. They were the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Advisor, and the Minister of Defense. Especially the Minister of Defense, as a member of the government cabinet, had the most direct power to mobilize the military. However, this was under normal circumstances. If there was a serious problem inside and outside the federal government, and the troops began to disobey the federal government's orders, then the head of the civilian organization, the Minister of Defense, because he didn't have a field army that he could directly command like the commanders of the military region and had extremely far-reaching influence, he would become marginal. Mr. President once ordered you to thoroughly investigate the case of the ancient bell. All the problems after that were caused by this investigation. Although Mr. President's order was revoked, I think with your personality, you will definitely continue to investigate. Yes, Shi Qinghai and I have found enough evidence to prove that Vice President Byron, several members of Parliament, the current director of the Bureau of Proclamation, and several generals were involved in the ancient bell incident. They stopped me from coming back because they were worried that I would continue to investigate, or they were worried that I would use the evidence found to send them to court. Sulu held the teacup in front of him. After a moment of silence, he continued, "The problem now is that if we want to go through the judicial channel to investigate, I need Mr. President to authorize or directly sign an order for the Ministry of Justice to take over. I'm very happy that you have this idea. We are the soldiers of the Federation. The military is not a tool for private people to vent their anger. However, when it comes to the special authorization of the Ministry of Justice, Mr. President." Minister Zhou looked out of the window at the green trees that looked like stars in the sky and said slowly, "Since the Parliament Hill incident, I haven't seen Mr. President. I didn't participate in the Parliament Hill Memorial Ceremony. I didn't participate in the cabinet meetings. Sometimes when I sit in this office and look at the ant-like people on the streets of the Capital Special District, I feel very uncomfortable sitting in this chair. Because now in the military, most people don't seem to want me to continue to be the Minister of Defense." Sulu looked at his tired and calm face and said, "You are the Minister of Defense appointed by Mr. President and voted by the Parliament Hill. The ordinary soldiers don't understand that the Federation's continuous attacks on the homeland of the Empire have been winning. But don't the generals understand the important role you played? Why should they ask you to step down? Reasons are always the most abundant thing in the universe." Minister Zhou sipped his tea and said with a smile, "My secretary was involved in the ancient Bell incident, suspected of treason, and murdered the commander of the Westwoods military region. This alone is enough reason for me to step down." Chapter 744. In the spacious minister's office on the top floor of the Ministry of National Defense building, the spring scenery in the distant alleys struggled to pass through the distance and projected a pitiful amount of light onto the glass. Minister Zhou calmly put down his teacup and rubbed his nose that had a red mark because of the glasses. He smiled and said, "You must know that some people in the government are questioning why Shi Qinghai happened to hold Yuzi hostage after killing so many people in Parliament Hill. I even heard that some people have started to ask lip-reading experts to analyze what Yuzi said to your friend." Su Li's straight black eyebrows couldn't help but furrow like a twisted blade. He stared at the tea in front of him, which was still as tall as before, and subconsciously shook his head. After a moment he asked in a deep voice, "Madam, what do you mean now? I have already told her everything I know. After knowing the truth of the ancient Bell explosion, what is she and the other families going to do?" For many years, Minister Zhou Yingxing had a distinct Thai family background. After Mr. Pabre became the president, as part of the political agreement, he directly became the Federation's Minister of National Defense. At that time he could even be seen as a strong spokesperson for the government and the military. However, as he gradually showed his courage and ability in the position of Minister of National Defense, he received recognition and praise from the President and many other officers of the Federation. His factionalism had faded a lot. Madam and the others will probably choose to continue watching. After all, the general's reputation has always been excellent, and the damage now hasn't affected the families themselves. As a millennial family that has secretly influenced and even controlled the Federation for countless years, the crazy ideas of the past few years are probably just some kind of repetitive game in their eyes. However, they don't understand that once the armed army starts to rush forward, it will be a dangerous situation that has never been seen before in history. Do you still remember what I said in the past? Minister Zhou mocked with a faint smile. The army is not allowed to have independent thoughts. Once this happens, it will become very scary. The old man said something similar. As a soldier of the Federation, I have always remembered it. Sulu replied, "I'm glad that you remember. I'm disappointed that more soldiers have forgotten." Minister Zhou slightly frowned. He looked out of the window again and said indifferently, "There's something you may not know yet. Half an hour ago, Commander Yu Chonghai was transferred from the Army General Hospital to the exclusive hospital of the 1st Military Region. His resignation letter and medical diagnosis were divided into two and placed on the table of General Li Jiedu and I, as a senior vice division level officer of the new 17th Division, or to be more precise, as the future division commander of the new 17th Division that the federal military had carefully nurtured. Sulu could no longer maintain his calm when he suddenly heard this news. He stood up abruptly, his lips trembling slightly. He wanted to ask something, but in the end he didn't ask. Commander Yu Chonghai, who was born a chef, looked like a harmless old man, but in reality, he was the last representative of the entire generation of outstanding soldiers under war god Li Pifu. In the war against the Empire, he led the new 17th Division to silently obtain victory after victory, restoring the unparalleled glory of the undefeated division of the past. But now, for some unknown reason, he was forced to leave his combat post. A few days ago, General Li Jiedu made a special trip to the headquarters of the new 17th Division to meet with Commander Yu. As for what they talked about, no one knows. Minister Zhou reminded. Sulu slowly lowered his head, a bitter and self-deprecating smile on his face. As the only son of war god Li Pifu, senior military figures like General Myers and Commander Yu Chonghai of the previous generation, even if they didn't agree with Li Jiedu's way of thinking, when faced with intense conflict, they would always remember whose descendant he was. Then, making the choice to remain silent and give in would not be surprising or shocking. At this moment, Sulu very naturally thought of the time he spent in the hot springs with the old man in Philadelphia, thought of the flashing lights in front of the manor, and even thought of Li Jiedu's gentle smile at the time. The successor of the war god? At the time, the entire Federation seemed to think that he was the chosen successor of the war god. But if Li Jiedu stood out, who would still think so? This was a very ironic and sad truth. Even if it was the Federation's war god Li Pifu, once he left this world, there was no way for him to decide who his successor would be. Minister Zhou looked at him and continued, Commander, you resigned, you were hunted down. It seems that in order to control the troops, some people have lost their rationality and become incomparably crazy. Sulu raised his head and suddenly asked seriously, have you ever imagined that General Li Jiedu could be the leader of the radical faction? No. Minister Zhou was silent for a moment before replying. I always thought that he was a gentle and respectable military theorist. It was very difficult for me to associate those conspiracies and murders with him. I also never thought of this possibility, but I didn't expect that the most impossible thing would become true. Sulu replied in a low voice. Do you want to meet with Li Jiedu? Minister Zhou asked with his brows slightly furrowed. No. There is no meaning in meeting now. Sulu shook his head and continued. As you said just now, he and those people have already lost their rationality and have fallen into some kind of hysterical madness. In my opinion, this kind of madness means that they have already begun to be afraid and have begun to panic. After a moment of consideration, he continued, I plan to hold a press conference. The time was originally set for tomorrow, but I want to bring it forward to today. Go be careful. Please be sure to be careful of your own safety. Killing you is because you have the ability to threaten their safety. Minister Zhou replied with a smile, I don't seem to have this ability, so I am safer than you. Sulu hesitated for a moment and asked, they forced you to resign, how are you going to deal with it? Do you want to discuss it with Lady Tai? The lady and those families can deeply influence the political structure of the Federation, but their influence on the military is extremely limited. After all, the military's true strength is a matter of the Constitution, and it is basically under the guidance of the war god. Minister Zhou said with emotion, so only the Lees of Philadelphia can influence the military. Of course, the Zhong family of the Westwood should also have this ability, but unfortunately, those families didn't stop or even tacitly allowed that tragedy to unfold. But I won't resign. Minister Zhou said calmly, while some people are busy fighting for or consolidating their power to realize their ambitions or ideals, someone has to remember that on the front lines, in the distant Empire Star region, there are hundreds of thousands of Federation soldiers fighting a bloody battle. They need supplies, ammo, and mechas. They don't care who wins in the Capital Ring's vanity contest, and this is my responsibility as the Minister of Defense. He looked at the young Federation officer and said with a smile, so I won't resign. I will be like a young man who has fallen in love for the first time, shamelessly cling to the position of Minister of Defense and strive to do something for the front lines. Sulu saluted the only federal military general, who truly had the demeanor of a scholar behind the table. Colonel Sulu. Colonel Sulu. Under the vigilant protection of the members of Iron Division, Sulu walked out of the elevator and prepared to pass through the spacious hall on the first floor of the Department of Defense. The officers he met on the way looked at him in surprise and saluted and greeted him with joy or nervousness. They didn't know why he suddenly appeared in the capital's special district when he was supposed to be carrying out a mission in the West Woods. Almost at the same time, there was a burst of dense and excited salutes and footsteps from the gorgeous revolving door of the Department of Defense building. Commander Xiaoqing. Commander Xiaoqing, hello? Surrounded by the officers of the Iron 7th Division, Du Xiaoqing, wearing a straight lieutenant general's uniform, walked in through the door. The officers of the Department of Defense who were busy carrying documents hurriedly stood at attention and saluted in surprise. They didn't know what Du Xiaoqing and the officers of the Iron 7th Division were carrying out, or were they having a meeting. But in short, just as Su Lu was about to leave, he appeared in the Department of Defense building. When he saw Su Lu also noticed his appearance. A faint light seemed to flash in their eyes, but neither of them took the initiative to stop. On the contrary, their footsteps were exceptionally firm and steady, without a trace of slowing down. They didn't stop, and the officers beside them naturally wouldn't stop either. Both of them had a cold and cool demeanor, looking straight ahead, facing each other, but not in each other's eyes. Seeing this sudden scene, thinking of the many rumors in the federal forces over the years, thinking of Du Xiaoqing and Su Li's various military exercises from their graduation day until recently, the originally noisy Department of Defense building suddenly quieted down, and the empty hall seemed even more spacious. Only the crisp sound of military boots on both sides could be heard, getting closer and closer. Right in the center of the Department of Defense building was a huge military emblem of the Federation. It was made of heavy carbon alloy bullet shells laid into the hard ground, and under the light, it shone with a cold light like a sword. When Su Lu and Du Xiaoqing walked past the military emblem of the Federation, they stopped at almost the same time. Commander Xiaoqing. Colonel Su Lu. Su Lu saluted, and Du Xiaoqing returned the salute. There was a moment of silence. Su Lu stared at the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose and said, "I just heard a sentence, and I want to pass it on to you. The army shouldn't have its own thoughts because it's too dangerous." Du Xiaoqing's expression was cold, and his hands were behind his back. He stood straight like the last surviving winter pine in the glacier. He slowly took off his sunglasses, looked at Su Lu expressionlessly, and replied, "Do you think I need you to tell me the concept proposed in Schiller's political drama?" Su Lu looked at his eyes and his hair that was obviously whiter than it was a few months ago, and said, "History will remember many things. I just want to remind you that no matter when, you and your troops must at least remember one thing. The duty of a soldier is to obey orders. According to the charter, they must completely obey the orders of the elected government of the Federation." Hearing this, Du Xiaoqing's cold expression suddenly had a strange change. The corners of his lips curled up, as if he wanted to smile, but in the end it only turned into a trace of coldness. "Colonel Su Lu, you know your position. I don't need you to nag like a woman. I also know what the duty of a soldier is." In the building of the Ministry of National Defense, two groups of officers stood behind the two of them, facing each other. Although it was impossible for them to point their guns at each other, they could clearly feel that the air was filled with the smell of stone after a high-speed collision, as if the stone could be crushed into powder at any time. The current situation was gradually becoming clear. Du Xiaoqing and his Iron 7th Division were one of the strongest supporters of the radical faction in the military. Su Lu hoped that he could use words to make the enemy surrender, but at this moment, he really had a lot to say to Du Xiaoqing. "I heard that Shimenjin died?" He looked at Du Xiaoqing and the officers of the Iron 7th Division with a serious expression. Then he slowly narrowed his eyes and smiled. "It's good that he died." Chapter 745. Colonel Su Lu, you have to take back what you just said. An officer of the Iron 7th Division said. And apologize for it. No. Su Lu simply refused this suggestion. He still looked into Du Xiaoqing's eyes and said, "You should know very well why Shimenjin died. In fact, he should have died 5 years ago. What I don't know now is how much you know about what happened 5 years ago, Commander Xiaoqing." In the latter half of the 37th Constitution, no one in the federal military dared to use such a forceful tone to question Du Xiaoqing face to face, not even those big shots. During the graduation day military drill at the training base, Although Sulu successfully prevented Du Xiaoqing from flipping out, he still had to play the role of a junior officer in front of Du Xiaoqing. He would never act as tough and equal as he did today in the empty hall. Although Du Xiaoqing was now a lieutenant general and he was only a colonel, there was a strict and insurmountable gap between the two of them. But for some reason, ever since the Westwood Sunset State Army returned after defying orders, it was difficult to find the influence of this difference in class in Su Li's attitude. Du Xiaoqing had been silently, or rather, indifferently looking at Su Lu. His right index finger gently slid along the edge of his sunglasses. No one knew what he was thinking. After a moment of silence, Su Lu suddenly asked in a low voice, "Commander Xiaoqing, if I remember correctly, you should also be a member of that so-called Trinity Association. I'm very curious, what exactly did you learn in that association? How to shoot your comrades in the back?" In literary works, the word suffocating was often used to describe tense confrontations. When it was used too many times, it often made people feel that it was a little old-fashioned. But today in the empty hall, the Department of Defense officers who saw this confrontation scene vaguely understood the reason for this description. Under the bright lights, the two groups of officers stood facing each other. They looked at each other in silence and did not speak loudly. The invisible collision and friction that gradually heated up seemed to have exhausted the oxygen in the surrounding environment and began to make it difficult for people to breathe. Standing in front of the elevator, standing in the corridor, and standing next to the plants, the officers had long forgotten their work. They nervously stared at the center of the hall. No one spoke. They even collectively subconsciously lowered the sound of their breathing, waiting for Commander Du Xiaoqing to open his mouth to respond. With his usual arrogance and indifference, he would suppress the other party's momentum or intensify the current situation. At this moment, the elevator door opened with an untimely beep. A female civilian officer's documents scattered all over the floor. The officers in the building subconsciously looked over, and then cast their eyes back to the place they needed to pay attention to. Du Xiaoqing still didn't say anything. Instead, it was Lu Sifu, the deputy commander of the Iron 7th Division, who was standing to his left, who provoked Su Lu in a cold voice. "I heard that Shi Qinghai is dead?" Su Li's pair of knife-like thick eyebrows slightly trembled. "It's good that he died," Lu Sifu added expressionlessly. Su Li's straight eyebrows finally raised. As if venting his anger, he waved his right arm and forcefully chopped down in the air, as if he wanted to break all the difficulties and obstacles in front of him into pieces of scrap metal. His extremely explosive reply resounded throughout the entire building of the Ministry of Defense. "It's a glorious death." These 4 words were like 4 hard stones that smashed onto the smooth floor of the hall. They smashed onto the insignia of the Federation that couldn't be spoken. They were suffused with a metallic luster and filled with a murderous aura. A dull sound echoed in the hall. Du Xiaoqing slightly lowered his eyes and looked at the insignia of the Federation at his feet. He seemed to be feeling Su Li's emotions at this moment. In the end, he still didn't say a word. He didn't reveal a trace of emotion. He slowly raised his right hand and put on his sunglasses again. They brushed past each other. There are very few. No, there has never been such a strange situation in this world. Even when my father returned to the capital ring from the Empire all those years ago and was faced with great pressure from Parliament Hill, he never displayed such strong confidence. A convoy of bulletproof military vehicles sped along the quiet roads of the capital's suburbs. Behind the trees in the fields beside the roads, the black silhouettes of several MX mechas could be faintly seen. They were silently following and protecting the convoy in a marching posture. There were very few people in the capital ring who could enjoy the privilege of being protected by military mechas. The present chairman of the Joint Staff Conference and commander of the 1st Military Region of the Federation, General Li Jiedu, in a real sense, the #1 person in the military, undoubtedly had this right. However, this wasn't the front lines. This was the capital special district that was countless light years away from the flames of war. A special district that hadn't experienced any turbulence in thousands of years. For him to actually need the protection of MX mechas when he was traveling, it could be seen that this military leader's current mood was indeed as he had said before. He was filled with some sort of absurd and strange sense of alarm. It is indeed very strange. Deliberately cut off from contact with the 17th Division. Now, he is just a mere colonel without any troops. Yet, it is precisely this kind of person who dares to walk so openly in this city with those 20 or so loyal subordinates of his. Moreover, we have no way of killing him. General Li Jiedu gazed at the flourishing late spring scenery outside the car window and said with a gentle smile, "These young soldiers are like trees that grow freely in the spring. Neither the wildfire nor the spring rain seems to be able to stop their powerful footsteps. On the contrary, it only helps them become even stronger. Of the 17 sniping points arranged, they have successfully evaded 15 of them. 2 of the sniping points have been destroyed." Sitting at the front of the car, the director of the 1st Military Region's Special Operations Room could not understand how those targets had managed to avoid these ambushes. He also could not understand why the general could still maintain such a gentle and calm state of mind in the face of such a strange situation. "I have never hoped that we could use snipers to eliminate the successor personally chosen by father. These are just some small tricks that are similar to using a tree branch to poke a bull. Through these small tricks we can clearly see just how far he can go. Then, when we eliminate him, we can make targeted arrangements." Li Jiedu gazed outside the car window. His expression was calm, and no one could see the danger contained in his words at this moment. "Sulu should already know that I know where his strength comes from. Then, he will think that we will be afraid, will panic, will become crazy, and thus lose without a fight. Those useless bullets will most likely help him think that we have already panicked, that we have already gone crazy. He will relax, and his confidence will become an arrogance that even he himself does not realize. This is very good. Even now, there are still many people who have fantasies about him. They think that they can persuade him, or use as peaceful a method as possible to eliminate him. I am very glad that Sulu is strong enough and confident enough. Then, step by step, he will push himself into an irreversible death zone. General, don't worry, we have arrived at the back of the mountain." The Tai family, whose enormous body was hidden in the shadows of history, was probably the recognized spiritual leader of the 7 major families. The Lees of Philadelphia, on the other hand, suddenly jumped onto the stage of the 37th constitutional era, dazzling and insufferably arrogant. These 2 families, who were supposed to be enemies, had actually always been in close contact with each other. If it was not because the Lees of Philadelphia had just started their inheritance, perhaps this kind of contact could already be called a family friend. Lady Tai of the back of the mountain and the recently deceased military god Li Pifu had always maintained a very close personal friendship because of those historical stories and memories of that traitor. This kind of friendship had lasted for many years. Perhaps it had never displayed its power under the sun, but in reality, it had played a very important role in ensuring the stability and rapid development of the Federation. If the glory of the Lees of Philadelphia began to be passed down, the back of the mountain formally prepared a purely private lunch. However, on the terrace facing the lake, the conversation between Lady Tai and General Li Jiedu did not seem to go as smoothly as imagined. The half-hanging late spring plants on the edge of the terrace turned their heads rustling, unwilling to waste time to distinguish how many invisible bullets were hidden in the seemingly ordinary conversation between these 2 important figures. "Madam, as you said, the political situation of the Federation is indeed in dire need of stability right now, especially after the Parliament Hill incident. The public's mood is very chaotic." Li Jiedu gently placed the silver spoon on the Guna porcelain plate. After a moment of silence, he gently continued, "But the problem right now is that if Colonel Sulu is allowed to continue investigating that case, not only will Vice President Byron's soul be disturbed after his death, you and those families will also be in a very difficult situation. The political situation will be shaken because of this, and most importantly, the public may lose their confidence in the government because of this. With your wisdom, you should be very clear about the dangers contained within this." Lady Tai held the teacup and silently looked at the lush green hills on the opposite side of the terrace. There was a sense of tranquility and strength in her extremely ordinary appearance. Sulu has the first-order authority of the Bureau of Proclamation, and this authority is helping him in some incomprehensible way. Li Jiedu continued calmly, "The Bureau of Proclamation has not yet found a way to deal with this authority. If you are not willing to help, this matter may really become difficult to control. General Li, actually I am not that much older than you, and now that your father has passed away, there is no need for you to still use honorifics with me. As for the issue of Su Li's authority, the old man should have some idea of it, but since he didn't tell me before his death, I naturally won't do anything. Lady Tai turned her head and looked at Li Jiedu. She slowly said, "You have kept a low profile for 20 years, but your father's old comrades and old friends like me have never underestimated your shrewdness and ability. I simply do not believe that you will begin your plan before you find a way to control Su Lu." After a moment of silence, Li Jiedu looked at the woman in front of him and said, "Madam, I know very well that you need to keep Su Lu alive, and to keep people like us in the military alive as the successor of the god of war, but the problem is, you know very well that Su Lu has never sat on a forklift board." Never sat on a forklift board. This was a very accurate description of Su Li's personality. Lady Tai's lips curved up in a trace of a smile. Li Jiedu looked at her and continued, "I believe that right now, you are very curious as to what he is saying at the press conference that is being held right now." Chapter 746. To hold a press conference at this time, it doesn't matter what he says. The important thing is that he shouldn't have said it in the first place. Li Jiedu picked up the black curly leaf tea in front of him and took a sip. A moment later, he continued to speak gently. "This proves once again that he, who has never sat on a seesaw, can never become the person who can balance the situation like you expect, no matter how good his foundation is, no matter how much my father and you favor him at the same time." He raised his head and looked at Lady Tai, saying calmly, "On the contrary, he will make the Federation situation more dangerous and complicated. Unfortunately, he has this ability." "No." Lady Tai smiled and replied, "According to my observation, that small-eyed boy is now more mature, or rather more vulgar. For you, for me, and for the Federation, this is an extremely good change." Speaking up to this point, the madam quietly looked into Li Jiedu's eyes and said with a trace of extremely light, almost to the point where it couldn't be smelled, "Otherwise, according to his style of stubbornly resisting my pressure to kill Macklin, even if you have more than 10 mechas by your side now, he would still be foolish enough to carry a few guns and run all over the Federation to kill you." These words were extremely continuous and destructive. Li Jiedu was slightly stunned, and his face revealed a slightly bitter smile of self-mockery. As the current #1 person in the federal military, he was intimidated by a colonel to the point where he had to carry a mecha whenever he went out. He really didn't have much dignity to speak of. From that year, when Sulu broke into the Oak State Tree Peace Foundation building, I no longer had any substantial influence over him. Therefore, regarding his problem, I think we don't need to discuss it anymore. Lady Tai's right arm lightly rested on the railing at the edge of the balcony. She usually liked to cook simple dishes, so her fingers weren't as smooth as those of other noble ladies. In the spring breeze, she slightly opened her hand, as if she wanted to grab onto something, but also as if she just wanted to feel that comfortable feeling. She gently looked at Li Jiedu, but there was an unquestionable seriousness. "What I want to know now is, after successfully weakening the Zhong family, how exactly do you plan to continue down this path? If it wasn't for Sulu informing me, perhaps I would still be in the dark." The madam laughed self-deprecatingly, shook her head and sighed. "I just said that we never underestimated your ability, but now it seems that you were able to hide in the shadows under your father's halo for so many years, patiently making such careful preparations. The so-called not underestimating is also a kind of underestimating, because for someone as strong as you, no one in the Federation is qualified to judge you." "Madam, you flatter me. These people only want to do something for the Federation," Li Jiedu replied gently. "As for the worries of you and those families, there is actually no need to worry. You asked me where we will go. I can't give you a definite answer right now because once the Federation stabilizes, the most important problem to consider is the front lines. Then we can only take one step at a time. But rest assured, we will never touch an untouchable situation." "Is this a promise?" Lady Tai's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze suddenly becoming extremely sharp. This question was extremely simple, but it definitely wasn't simple. This meant that the radical forces of the federal military would take a stance towards the 7 families in the Federation's political situation in the future. And this stance would, without a doubt, directly affect the Federation in the years to come. However, when faced with this question that carried countless implications, General Li Jiedu's answer was actually that calm and concise. Of course, the people left the terrace and the scenery of late spring was thick. Lady Tai narrowed her eyes slightly, gazing at the lake and mountains in her embrace. Suddenly, she released an almost inaudible sigh, lightly asking in self-mockery, "Do you believe in his promises? When soldiers become politicians, their promises don't have any meaning." Shunli quietly stood behind Lady Tai, playing a role that hadn't changed for several years. Lady Tai's brows slightly furrowed, her voice slightly cold as she said, "I like a more direct answer, not this type of dramatic tone thing." Secretary Shun keenly sensed that Lady Tai's mood was a bit bad, so he obediently nodded in agreement. "The situation won't change?" Lady Tai expressionlessly shook her head, stood up, and leaned against the railing, leaving no trace on her face. If they didn't want to create a situation that hasn't changed for thousands of years, why would these soldiers be so excited to throw themselves into the dark side of politics that they hated the most in the past? Once the steel monsters have their own consciousness, their appetite will become extremely greedy. Any former overlord is nothing more than a few pieces of delicious synthetic meat in their eyes. Lady Tai turned around to look at Butler Jean, who had appeared out of nowhere, indifferently saying, "Make some preparations. If nothing unexpected happens, this long-term struggle may last for many years." "Yes." Butler Jean and Secretary Shin bowed at the same time. Lady Tai didn't say anything else. Her simple order was passed down to the huge invisible empire through the hands of these two people in charge of the Tai family, and it would immediately start changing the direction of many things. In order to face the unprecedented challenge that might come, these families that had lived, grown, or rotted together with the Federation for thousands of years had to make some preparations. She lightly touched the railing of the balcony, looking at the picturesque landscape in silence. She really didn't understand where the militants' confidence came from. Just one sure Qinghai was enough to put them in a terrible situation, and their partners in the government were all purged and killed. Could it be because of the few troops that Li Jiedu controlled? At the end of the day, Payable was an elected president who was highly popular with the people. He had the innate loyalty of the federal army. Most importantly, outside the official residence there was still that Sulu who seemed to never die. Who would obtain the final victory? What did Sulu say at the press conference? Lady Tai suddenly remembered this matter. For the Federation's press, Sulu was without a doubt extremely newsworthy. Whether it was the national girl scandal that caused a lot of commotion years ago, or the countless heroic deeds that later shocked the Federation, they all proved this point. But for the Federation's press, Sulu was without a doubt the most unpopular person to interview among all the famous people in the Federation. This young colonel, perhaps inherited the style of Philadelphia's army god, had never accepted an interview in the past few years, except for the press conferences that were arranged by the president's official residence and the Ministry of Defense. So when the major media received the news that he was going to hold a press conference, they were all very surprised. Although the time of the press conference was changed again and again, the media had no complaints. With excitement and nervousness, they waited for the Federation's hero, who was qualified to become a news event, to appear. A very small number of reporters who had the most sensitive sense of smell, or the most powerful intelligence source vaguely guessed that this press conference might be related to the terrorist attack that shocked the entire universe a dozen days ago on Parliament Hill. The funeral of the Federation's vice president, Mr. Byron, and the two senators had just finished, and the entire Federation was still in mourning. What exactly did Colonel Sulu want to do? Or rather, what did he want to say? With this sharp question in mind, when Sulu, wearing sunglasses, walked into the conference room of the George Carlin Cultural and Arts Center under the flashing lights after the press conference began, reporter Wood from the Capital Special District Daily asked without hesitation and without paying attention to Gu Shifeng, who was acting as the host on the podium. He shouted loudly, "Colonel Sulu, according to my sources, the body of Shi Qinghai, the suspect of the terrorist attack on Parliament Hill, was forcefully taken out of the police station building by you and your team members last night. May I ask if you have any explanation for this accusation? Or should I say, do you want to confirm it? Even if he was a Federation war hero, forcibly taking away the body of a terrorist attack suspect on a day when the people of the Federation were collectively mourning would not be forgiven or understood by anyone." As soon as the press conference began, A reporter asked such a sharp question, which instantly made the venue, which had just quieted down a little, noisy. The whispers were filled with the exclamations of the reporters, who did not know what had happened last night. On the podium, Sulu took off the wide sunglasses on his nose bridge, revealing a pair of small but exceptionally sincere eyes. He glanced at the reporters in front of him, and was somewhat surprised to find that the one who asked such a sharp question was actually Wood from the Capital's Special District Daily. The camera in the photographer's hand continued to flash, and the high-definition camera had already started working. In the camera, Sulu lowered his head and thought for a very short period of time. Then he held the edge of the table and raised his head. He looked at the reporters and answered very simply, "Yes, I took his body out of the police station building last night. I can confirm this with all of you. Also, I can tell you that he has been buried in a good place." The reporters immediately fell into another wave of restlessness. They really did not expect that Sulu would actually directly admit that he was related to the terrorist attack suspect. These reporters, who were more or less emotionally inclined towards Sulu, looked at the podium with worry and puzzlement. They thought to themselves, "Don't you understand that doing so is tantamount to challenging the psychological bottom line of the people of the Federation?" No matter how worried and puzzled they were, the reporters still had to follow the requirements of their profession and use the fastest speed to compile a concise news article and publish it to their respective newspapers or television stations. Then, a reporter from the 3 Linlin Forum Daily seized the opportunity and asked first, "Why? You should know very well that this is already a violation of the Federation's laws." It was a very simple 3 words, but it was the answer that all the reporters, and perhaps all the people of the Federation who were about to be filled with indignation and grief, wanted to know. Why would a hero of the Federation disobey military orders and return from the West Woods? It was all to bury a terrorist who had committed heinous crimes. Leave the legal issues to the lawyers, and I will answer my own questions. Why did I do this? Sulu narrowed his eyes and spaced out for a while, then answered very seriously, "Because in my heart, the guy who rushed into Parliament Hill is not a terrorist, and definitely not some messy thing like a spy of the Empire. His name is Shi Qinghai, and he is my best friend. He is the guy that the Federation needs to thank the most." Chapter 747. In the southern suburbs of the capital, in the George Carlin Foundation Art Center, on the enormous hologram outside the building was a high-definition rotating shot of the environment. The peach blossoms within reach were in full bloom in the spring breeze. The conference room inside the building was completely silent. The slightly cool breeze from the air exchange system seemed to want to freeze everything in the room. The reporters were either lowering their heads, biting the end of their pens, frowning, or opening their mouths slightly, listening to Suli's calm and simple narration on the stage. This was the story of a spy from Green Dragon Mountain. That spy was called Shi Qinghai. When he was young, his family suffered a calamity because of a certain large enterprise of the Federation. He used his excellent grades to enter the Capital University-affiliated high school, and then entered the first military academy to further his studies. After graduation, he was assigned to the 4th section of the Federation Investigation Bureau's Linhai branch. His future was bright. However, no one knew that as early as in school, he had already been absorbed by the intelligence system of Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government army. He became a fish in that famous deep sea that no one had ever seen. For all the people of the Federation, Shi Qinghai is just a very unfamiliar name. He is just an unremarkable stranger. So when the Green Dragon Mountain Committee recognized his identity and produced evidence that he had already been fired, you would very naturally believe that he is a fallen spy with no future. So you can very easily believe the results of the Federation government's investigation. He broke into Parliament Mountain and didn't hesitate to use his life to kill Vice President Byron and the members of Parliament. He is just a deranged crazy terrorist who was bought over by some power that hasn't found a scapegoat yet. But I know him. He is handsome, confident, and gentle. His grades are so good that he can enter the Trinity Association. His pair of peach blossom eyes can charm all women. Although it sounds like I am looking for a wife for him, it is the truth. As long as he is willing, he can easily obtain wealth and status that ordinary people can't imagine. Mr. Pabre took a military transport plane and landed in Green Dragon Mountain. He completed the Great Reconciliation Agreement that surprised everyone. He was the one who completed the contact arrangements. 4 years ago, Macklin died in the building of the Huanshan Four States Foundation. He and I did it together. I believe that the WikiLeaks video released in the past year is enough for you to digest the shock brought by this news. You can also roughly understand that he once helped the Federation solve its biggest problem. Mr. President pardoned him without anyone knowing. He served as the liaison officer between the Special Forces and the Department of Defense. In the distant Westwoods occupied planet, he hid in the deep snow alone, wielding the big gun that rang out in front of Parliament Hill. God knows how many Imperial officers he killed. This is the George Carlin Foundation Art Center. 2 years ago, the documentary called Team 7 won all the awards here. My teammates and I were pushed onto the stage by your cheers, and we enjoyed the courtesy of the entire Federation. In fact, Shi Qinghai once fought side by side with us, and he was also qualified to stand under the spotlight, but he chose to walk into the shadows behind the lights again. There was a long silence in the conference room. It was not that the reporters did not have any questions they wanted to ask, but they could clearly tell from Su Li's expression that he had more to say. Su Lu rubbed his eyebrows and said, "As I said just now, he is my best friend. So when Mr. President authorized me to investigate the attack on the ancient bell, he who had no obligation to take the risk to help me, once again walked into the darkness and began to pursue the clues that were about to be forgotten by people." After a short pause, he looked at the reporters who were taking notes and said seriously, "He is used to walking in the darkness, but he is more dazzling than anyone else. A person like this can't be a terrorist. I hope the people of the Federation can understand this. He has a definite reason for everything he does, and only those reasons can make him do so many things that you think are inconceivable." At this point, a reporter finally could not suppress his emotions and raised his hand to ask, "Including the attack on Parliament Hill?" "Yes," Su Lu replied. The reporters easily deduced a shocking conclusion from these words. Someone asked in a loud voice, "Colonel Su Lu, do you think that Vice President Byron and those counselors are related to the attack on the ancient bell by the Imperial fleet?" "I didn't say that. In fact, Shi Qinghai and I have been investigating this matter." Su Lu raised his head and looked at the reporter who asked the question in the corner. "That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous." The reporters were shocked and couldn't accept Su Li's words. Although the Federation had investigated the attack on the ancient bell a few months ago, and seemed to have found some new suspicious points, it was really hard to imagine that the Vice President of the Federation was involved in this matter. The last investigation had to be terminated for reasons that everyone knows. Su Lu looked at the reporters and said, "At that time, Shi Qinghai and I already had some evidence, but unfortunately, we didn't have the chance to continue the investigation. According to the sources of the Department of Defense, you didn't get permission to leave the Westwoods, which is a serious violation of military regulations." Reporter Wood, who had been silent for a while, held an electronic ink pen between his fingers and asked thoughtfully, "What's the purpose of insisting on returning to the capital ring, even at the risk of being punished by military law? Are you trying to clear your friend's name? Or do you want to continue the investigation that was interrupted last time?" "I will ask for a second authorization from Mr. President to restart the investigation on the ancient bell," Su Lu replied. "If there are any new findings or evidence, I will inform all of you immediately within the scope of the charter." The reporters frowned and shook their heads subconsciously. They were not satisfied with or did not agree with Su Li's vision of the future situation. "If that's the case, why did you hold this press conference before getting a second authorization from Mr. President? What's your purpose for holding this press conference alone?" Reporter Wood keenly saw the problem and continued to ask, "I want to officially inform some people." Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the nearest camera, as if he was looking at the big shots in the Federation's political and military circles behind the camera. After a short pause, he said seriously, "I'm back, and I'm going to restart the investigation. Are you ready?" After the press conference ended, it was almost dusk. The second day of Su Li's return to the capital ring passed quickly and nervously. The shadows of the buildings and the red clouds mixed into a large colorful mixture, and the originally pink peach blossoms suddenly became bright red. The reporters left the George Carlin Foundation Art Center in twos and threes, but no one was in a hurry to return to the newspaper office or the TV station. Instead, they chose to call their acquaintances to the nearby tavern for a few drinks. They heard the extremely explosive news at the press conference, but there was no way to share it with anyone. They had to immediately express the countless questions in their hearts and express the shock in their minds with their colleagues. Without Suli's clear evidence, no matter how much the media worshipped the freedom of the press, it was impossible to publish the news that the vice president of the Federation was suspected of colluding with the Imperial fleet. This had nothing to do with the pressure of the press director in the president's residence. The integrity of the journalists required them to have evidence, and the atmosphere in which the entire Federation was mourning for Vice President Byron was an invisible ruler. Sulu did not leave the art center. The members of Group 7 were scattered around the building, controlling all the dangerous sniping points and guarding his safety outside the window in the red twilight. In the meantime, he was talking to reporter Wood in a low voice in the room. "Why did you ask me to stay alone?" Wood asked in confusion. "Because I trust you. However, I thought that Chief Editor Bob would come with you." Sulu explained with a smile. "It seems that my news popularity is still not enough to attract Chief Editor to come personally." Wood shrugged and said with slight ridicule, "In the past 2 years, you have rejected 3 of my interview requests, and now you say that you trust me. Please don't tell me that this is because we did the last interview with the war god." Sulu shook his head. After a moment of silence he said, "Do you remember what I just said about Macklin?" At that time in the entire Federation's press circle, only the Capital Special District Daily News dared to question that old man and even investigate him. "If that friend of yours, Shi Qinghai, was really involved in the assassination of Macklin, I will prudently express my trust in him. However, this trust is not much because in my opinion, his cold-blooded performance on Parliament Hill is not what you would call an idealist." Wood lit a cigarette and took 2 puffs. In the pungent smoke that filled the air, he said with a hint of pride, "Speaking of the Macklin case, I led a group of paparazzi to S2 and investigated it for dozens of days. It should be considered the proudest thing in my life." Sulu looked at the red flower that was reflected in the window glass at his feet and suddenly said, "Before you went to investigate, you should have received an electronic document about the investigation of Macklin." Wood frowned slightly. He held the cigarette between his fingers. He did not understand how the other party knew about this. In fact, until today, he still did not know who sent the documents to the newspaper. Those were all found by Shi Qinghai. Sulu smiled at the shocked reporter Wood. He took out a microchip from the pocket of his military jacket and handed it over. "Just now at the press conference I said that we did not find any evidence. In fact, I was lying. This microchip hides the evidence of Vice President Byron and those few senators involved in the case. I am giving this evidence to you because I trust you and Chief Editor Bob. And I trust you because although Shi Qinghai and I have not fought side by side with you, we have indeed fought together." Wood was silent for a moment. He slowly and carefully put out the cigarette by his feet. After taking 2 deep breaths, he took the microchip with a serious expression and said, "What should we do?" Chapter 748. You and Chief Editor Bob are professionals. You should be able to find the most suitable time to publish these things, but not now. The official residence should be under tremendous pressure right now. What we need to do is to cooperate with Mr. President's pace and rhythm." Sulu said, "The incident on Parliament Hill just happened. The public is very agitated. There are still hundreds of thousands of Federation soldiers on the front lines of the Imperium. The capital ring can't fall into chaos. As far as I know, other than attending Vice President Byron's funeral, Mr. Prabal has not appeared in public for more than 10 days, citing the need to increase the security level." Wood took a puff of his cigarette and reminded him with a slightly hoarse voice, "This situation is not common. If the president really has a plan to deal with this matter, how do you and I know? How can we cooperate? To solve this matter, and to solve it as safely as possible, we must go through the judicial route." Sulu also lit a cigarette and continued, Mr. President is safe right now. However, some people have quietly built a wall within the government and even within the official residence. We should be able to find a reason to overthrow this wall by gradually applying pressure from the outside." He was about to say something else, but the burning smell and smoke from the front of the number 37 brand cigarettes lingered in front of his eyes. It was a bit of a hindrance. He suddenly realized that it was more like he was talking to himself. There was no need to say too much. Just like before, doing things was always more important than talking. When reporter Wood left the George Carlin Foundation Art Center, dusk had not yet completely faded. The peach blossoms by the street were smiling in the rich spring breeze and the golden warmth. Sulu felt that it was somewhat dazzling. When he was about to put on his sunglasses, he saw a girl that he had never expected to see appear in front of him. Therefore, the wide sunglasses froze in front of his chin in a somewhat comical manner. She was wearing an inconspicuous light gray sports windbreaker, just like the one she wore when she left the spaceport and headed to Cylon's concert amidst the cheers of countless soldiers. The hood of the windbreaker covered her head and face completely, covering her beautiful hair that had long turned from purple to black and from short to long. The occasional glimpse of her exquisite eyes under the hood's shadow was still enough to amaze everyone. After the grand funeral and the completion of the statue of Li Pifu, Jian Shuier did not return to the Federal Fleet. Instead, she returned to Philadelphia and spent some peaceful time with the old man in the grave. During this period of time, Su Lu, who was far away in the West Woods, kept a correspondence with her. However, because of so many things that happened one after another, the love that had just become hot on the desolate planet of the Empire unfortunately did not have the chance to burn into an intoxicating flame. "I always thought that men and women in love should communicate more passionately with each other." Jian Shuier walked in front of him, gently held his arm, and said with a smile, "And should not deliberately keep too far away from each other." The members of Group 7 scattered around the stone steps of the art center, as well as the members responsible for sniping and security missions further away, looked at the slender hand that passed through Su Li's arm through their own eyes or long-range binoculars. They could not help but sigh softly in their hearts at the same time. They could not help but feel envious and jealous. Sulu smiled bitterly and said, "It's been a bit troublesome recently. Although our relationship has indeed developed a bit too lightly, and we have not even met much." Jian Shuier shrugged cutely, hugged his hand tighter and said, "But if I were your girlfriend, the more troublesome things are, the more you should tell me. This is indeed my problem." Sulu said with some shame, "It's probably because I have never been in a serious relationship before, so I didn't consider it thoroughly." "Forgive you." Jian Shuier raised her head slightly, her beautiful chin carrying a trace of mockery, her watery eyes reflecting the sunset. Then the two began to walk along the streets of the southern part of the capital. Within a range of 200 meters, on top of a tall building even further away, 20-some members of Group 7 vigilantly guarded the surroundings. The setting sun pulled their shadows very long, very long. The slow and seemingly extremely casual walk did not seem to require any destination. The love between the hero of the Federation and the nation's maiden should have been the most beautiful event in this constitutional calendar. However, in this turbulent era, countless passionate and ugly events happened one after another, leaving no time for people to watch or even catch their breath. There was actually no chance for a beautiful release. Speaking of which, this was actually the first time that Su Lu and Jian Shuier walked like real lovers. It was just that this seemingly peaceful and beautiful love scene had no choice but to wrap around the members of Group 7 and slowly roll around like a snowball. It made people speechless. Moreover, in this extremely rare and precious stroll, the young man and woman's conversation still couldn't help but be extremely unharmonious with the scenery of late spring. In particular, Jian Shuier was extremely clear about the relationship between him and the man from Green Dragon Mountain who had charged into Parliament Mountain. The nation's maiden beside him had already grown up. She still carried a beauty that could topple the entire Federation, adding a bit of gradually maturing brilliance. Sulu knew better than anyone what kind of clear ideals and perseverance Jian Shuier possessed under her moving appearance. After all, she was the daughter of the #1 traitor of the Federation and the Empress of the Empire. She had inherited the most inconceivable rebellious and daring traits of her parents. However, when he said that Li Jiedu was the behind-the-scenes leader of the radical faction in the military, he still found it somewhat hard to imagine that Jian Shui'er didn't show any shock in her eyes. I've always known that this cousin of mine, Li Jiedu, is a very extraordinary person. Over the years, even the most perceptive people in the Federation have only noticed his low profile. They have never thought that behind that low profile is a meticulous thinking and truly powerful self-confidence. Jian Shui'er leaned on his shoulder and said softly, "For such an extraordinary person to use such a long time to plan something, then the height he intends to reach must be extremely frightening. If you insist on standing on the opposite side of him, then I only have one piece of advice for you. When facing him, you can't be too cautious. Don't worry too much. These days I've been working hard to learn how to get rid of the color of impulsiveness." Sulu raised his head to look at the flat red ball in the middle of the street. He frowned, but there was a smile on his face. "On the contrary, I think that cousin of yours should be troubled right now. He needs to be more careful. How many years have we known each other?" Jian Shui'er quietly looked at his face and asked. "If we count from the victory concert, then it's the autumn of the 68th year of the constitutional calendar. It's been more than 3 years." Sulu seriously thought about it, then said with a smile, "Of course, if we count from the time you played that little orphan girl on TV, it's been about 10 years, right? You know, I grew up watching the TV shows you acted in. I often hear these kinds of jokes that aren't funny at all." Jian Shui'er shrugged and said with a smile, "Actually, what I want to say is that in the past 3 years, you have indeed changed a little. Although you still don't talk too much, you're not as quiet as you used to be." She glanced at the members of Group 7 behind her in the shadows of the street and shook her head with emotion. "And you seem to be a lot more confident. With just these few companions, you dare to claim that the most powerful man in the federal military is afraid of you. In the past, because of your unscrupulous father, I became a fugitive in the Federation. I was as nervous as a frozen fart all day long, so of course I'm more quiet," Sulu said. Jian Shui'er interrupted, "I know what's going on in the military, but I'm still impressed by your novel and vulgar way of describing things." Sulu continued with a smile, "Later your cousin, and the vice president who died at the hands of Shi Qinghai, wanted to use this incident to pin me down. In the end, my grandfather stepped in and helped me. The biggest hidden danger in my life, the heaviest stone in my heart, suddenly disappeared. Of course, my mood improved a lot. When a person is in a good mood, they're willing to talk more. As for confidence, of course, General Li Jiedu is a very excellent and dangerous person. But as long as I'm not stupid enough to put myself in a dead end, I can't think of any way he can control me." Su Li's thick eyebrows furrowed again. The corners of his lips were tightly pressed together, and he pointed at the few high-rise buildings in front of him and said, "You see, I know very well where the dangers are, so these dangers don't exist for me." "I don't really understand what you're trying to say." In the shadow of the hoodie, that pair of elegant eyebrows furrowed beautifully. She looked at the buildings in the twilight and laughed at herself in confusion. Then she turned her head and looked very seriously at Su Li's face. She studied his straight eyebrows, small eyes, and the faint traces of hardships that added a bit of a man's calmness. "I'm a member of the Lees of Philadelphia. I know better than you that the blood of the Lee family is very stubborn and conservative. My cousin may be the most terrifying schemer, but I don't doubt that in his heart, the glory of the family occupies the most important position." "I've never doubted that," Sulu said. "For so many years, for so many things to have done, I believe that a large part of the reason is that he has always been planning how the Lee family can continue to maintain its current status, or rather, its glory after the death of the war god. Why are you suddenly talking about this?" He looked at Jian Shui'er in confusion. "Right now, this dangerous and sensitive situation is one that we have no way of alleviating. It's probably only under certain circumstances that he will give up part of his plan. For example, he won't kill you but instead try to subdue you. At the very least, it won't be in the next second that the entire Federation will become a battlefield full of blood and fire because of the two of you, so..." Jian Shui'er looked at him and smiled. Her eyes narrowed into cute moons. She tilted her head and said, "Let's get married." Hearing these words, Su Li's eyes couldn't help but narrow. Everyone knew that whenever he narrowed his eyes into two slits, it meant that he was in a relatively nervous state. Perhaps he was preparing to kill, or preparing to be killed, or perhaps preparing to get married. The stroll under the setting sun unknowingly came to a stop in front of an ordinary building. This was the marriage registration office of a certain district of the capital. The light screen above the registration office was broadcasting a poorly made picture of flowers. In this spring, a certain person's eyes narrowed like flowers. Chapter 749. In this moment of twilight, Sulu thought of many scenes from the past. He watched her on TV, he cried in the woods of Hushi State, he went to her concert, and he thought that it was the most beautiful dream that had appeared before his eyes. He suddenly remembered that he did not meet her before the victory concert, but during that earlier concert filled with slaughter. After that, they became familiar with each other until they went on a blind date. In every similar scene, he would always think of many scenes from the past. It was not that the art appraisal in the library of Hushi State University had really cultivated a strong artistic style, but that those scenes were too deep in his mind. Let's get married. What was very interesting was that in the countless scenes that Sulu, who was not an artistic youth, suddenly and forcefully wedged into the image of that white-robed, bare-legged, ultra-literary middle-aged man. For the peace, love, and justice of the universe, you have to be together. Be together, Master Fan of the Empire once said. Squinting at the colorful flowers blooming on the wall of the marriage registration office, Sulu gently hugged Jian Shuier. Letting the warm embrace melt into the twilight, the barbecue stall on the streets of Wangdu was filled with the smell of chives and bean rolls. The cheap black market stall had 3 extremely out-of-place bottles of expensive Wenjun No. 1. The amber liquor rippled in the glasses, just like the clumsy and confused expression that Sulu could not suppress at this moment. Xiong Linquan and a few other team members were silently eating dinner at a nearby table. They looked up from time to time but did not sit over because Zhou was sitting at this table. And then, Zhou had clearly drunk a lot. Her beautiful face was flushed. She narrowed her eyes at Sulu and asked, "Did you guys register?" "No, this matter was too sudden." Sulu answered very seriously. "I promised her that after this matter was settled, we would immediately get married. That hooligan must be very happy that you finally got the most famous woman in the Federation." Zhou looked at her slender fingers and said, "I've never had a problem with your messy love life, as long as you don't marry that disgusting Zhang Xiaoming." She raised her head and looked at him with slight ridicule. "What about Shang Qiu and Nan Xiangmei?" Sulu stared at the wine glass in front of him. Suddenly he grabbed it and drained it in one gulp. Stimulated by the alcohol, he frowned and muttered to himself, "I'm only one person. The Federation is not like Bermuda, where I can casually marry a few more." Zhou frowned and looked at him. Her nose moved slightly as if he was a smelly stone in a septic tank. She said sarcastically, "You are not making a choice but avoiding a choice. Although the effect is the same, you are not fucking manly enough. Take that national girl for example. She actually asked the girl to take the initiative to propose. Are you a man?" She also drained the wine in her glass in one gulp and mocked, "Now that I think about it, that guy was actually more manly than you." Before he died, he still remembered the women he had messed with. Sulu wanted to argue about who was more manly, the playboy Shi Qinghai and a useless guy like himself. He just felt that the way Zhou promoted Nan Xiangmei just now was very similar to the way Little Watermelon promoted Shang Qiu in the old mansion in the 2nd latitude district of Sunset Province. Suddenly, a little boy's sharp cursing voice came from the table next to them. Zhou Liuhua was probably not used to the smell of the barbecue stall in the night market. He was desperately twisting his body in the arms of the nanny, crying and cursing as he kicked his legs, leaving several footprints on the nanny's clothes. Su Li's face was a little ugly. He looked at Zhou and said, "Why is he so bad-tempered? Stubborn, proud, violent and cold." Naturally, he inherited it from his evil young mother, Zhou replied self-deprecatingly. "I spent too much time on the front line. I really didn't expect you to teach him to be like this." Sulu said with a sullen face, "You'd better control him, or else I really can't help but beat him up. It's normal for little boys to be naughty. They're still young. They'll be fine when they grow up." When Zhong Huiyan was 5 years old, He already knew how to follow me in the ventilation tunnel without saying a word. Temperament has nothing to do with age. Zhou stared at him coldly and said, "This is my son. I'd like to see who dares to beat him up." From a biological and legal point of view, he has two fathers. Now that one of them is dead, if I don't discipline him, who will? Sulu paused for a moment and said self-deprecatingly, "I remember the scene when I bumped into you and your sister in front of the nightclub in Linhai province. I don't want Lu Hua to be beaten into a pig's head by the second Shi Qinghai in the future." "I hope he's the second Shi Qinghai." Zhou frowned and slowly lowered her head. Then she raised her head and drank another glass of wine. Sulu looked at her quietly. Suddenly, he said to the little boy who was struggling and crying at the table next to them, "If you don't listen to me, I'll beat you to death." His voice wasn't loud, and his attitude didn't look very fierce. But strangely, children were probably like animals and were naturally sensitive to real danger. Zhou Liuhua stared blankly at the uncle who was sitting with his mother. He immediately pursed his lips and let his snot drip down. He didn't even dare to make a sound of sobbing. The nanny looked at Sulu gratefully. The little boy didn't know whether it was because he was too tired from crying, or because he was scared by Sulu. He hugged the nanny's neck tightly and fell asleep. The Ministry of Justice and the relevant departments, as well as the civilian agencies in the building of the Ministry of National Defense, are still under the control of the official residents. When the Federation begins to stir up a stir, Mr. President will have sufficient reason to either reauthorize me or authorize the Ministry of Justice to continue investigating the case of the ancient bell. I think even Parliament Hill will be on our side at that time. At that time it will be General Li Jiedu's turn to make a difficult decision. Should he wait for the investigation to end or fight to the death? Yes, he will definitely choose the latter, and I will also wait for him to choose the latter. Sulu looked at Zhou, whose eyebrows were getting tighter and tighter, and explained in a low voice, "I am not good at political schemes. I will only force them to take action. I will keep an eye on the slightest change in the troops that Li Jiedu can command. As long as they really do take action, I will stop them and get all the evidence in my hands. With this arrangement, the turmoil in the Federation can be controlled, and as long as I stay in the official residence, the most important thing, the safety of Mr. President, can be perfectly guaranteed." Zhou frowned and held her chin. She suddenly felt that the knowledge she had learned over the years and the judgment and analysis ability that helped Sulu before were all very funny. This is an idiot's logical deduction. At this moment in her eyes, Sulu really looked like an idiot. She said sarcastically, "You said a lot of nonsense, but the most important thing is the word stop. How can you stop the fully armed federal forces? And the safety of Mr. President, how can you guarantee it?" Zhou spread her hands and stared at him angrily. "Do you think you are the great creator who can turn thousands of armored vehicles and mechas into scrap metal with just a few words? Yes, according to the charter of the Federation, President Pabre could easily control the army, as long as the army did not have its own thoughts. But now the key was that the army had the most invincible armed force in the universe and had started to have its own thoughts. Who could stop all this? Sulu raised his wine glass to toast the worried girl in red. He thought to himself that he could indeed turn thousands of armored vehicles, mechas, and even battleships into scrap metal. With the support of the glory of the charter, a certain someone could do anything. But do I have to tell you this? Chapter 750. Have you thought about Li Feng's problem? Zhou gently swirled the wine glass with her fingers. The beautiful amber color contrasted nicely with the terrible leek paste. "I forgot," Sulu replied. Zhou looked up at him. After thinking for a moment, she said seriously, "You forced your way back to the capital ring and then came up with this so-called plan. In my opinion, it's still laughably naive, but it's only natural when you think about it. You're an engineer who's only good at dealing with machines, numbers, and formulas. It's indeed a bit difficult for you to think about these problems. At least you're willing to think about it, which means you've improved. Perhaps this is a kind of regression." Sulu shrugged. "This answer is somewhat interesting. It's much better than the average speech level you've shown in the past. Zhou mocked, back to your naive plan. Of course, I firmly admit that if you're really the creator, then no matter how boring your plan is, it'll work. And Mr. President will definitely be happy to see this, so, Sulu, I'll pray for you. Sulu and the members of Group 7 silently disappeared into the night on the streets of Wangdu. No one knew where their destination was and no one knew what they were going to do. Zhou sat at the night market stall with a wine glass in her hand. She did not say any useless prayers for a certain person. She just sat there silently, occasionally pouring the wine into her bright red lips. The strong wine almost made her red lips burn. Other than the owner of the barbecue stall, whose expression was much more numb than before, there were no other customers. The nanny carried the child to the car. The two orderlies at the table in the distance looked at her worriedly, worried that she would turn into the rumored unruly and cold young lady when she was drunk. A black car silently slid over like a ghost. There was no logo on the car, not even any eye-catching decorations, but for Zhou, she could easily recognize this specially made black car. There were no more than 10 of them in the entire universe. Zhou waved her hand to signal the two orderlies to stay where they were and not to come over. Zhou took a deep breath and carefully tidied her clothes. She adjusted the angle of the red flower on her temple to be impeccable. Then she revealed a kind and reserved smile that gave a sense of distance. She stood up and greeted them respectfully. There was no need to worry about the black car at the back of the mountain. Li Xuan had officially begun his political career in S2 Oak State. Sulu had just quietly left in a black car, so the person in the black car could only be that madam. And that madam was qualified to be welcomed by anyone in the Federation, let alone the girl she had single-handedly cultivated at the afternoon tea party back then. Yuzi, long time no see. Lady Tai looked at Zhou with a smile and then sat down. This simple action surprised Zhou a little. She never thought that madam would sit on a roadside stool covered in grease. This was not a ridiculous reservedness of a rich person who had not experienced the affairs of the world, but a very natural minimum requirement of life. Madam, yes, long time no see. Zhou calmed her mind and responded with a smile. The curvature of her lips was very beautiful. It was not dazzling, but it was not mediocre. You are calmer than before, and you are more independent than before. This is very good. We women should never put the hope of a happy life on men who have no hope at all. Lady Tai said with a light sigh, what a pity. Back then I only thought you had a big butt, and now I am discovering more and more of your good points. Unfortunately, it is already too late. Zhou's face revealed a rare bit of embarrassment. A big butt and good fertility, this type of vulgar and somewhat contemptuous evaluation, normally would easily make a woman unhappy, but she was already used to hearing this type of evaluation in her adolescence. Moreover, Lady Tai's tone always carried a natural and refreshing autumn air. I came to see you today mainly for two reasons. Lady Tai looked at her with a smile and said, the first is what Sulu said to you just now. The second is, I really want to know, from your point of view, who exactly will obtain the final victory in this situation. After a moment of silence, Zhou said what she could casually say. Then she furrowed her brows slightly and said, although I don't think Sulu is a guy who is good at political structure, I agree with one of his judgments. Even if Li Jiedu's intelligence and ability is astonishing, in the end, he is not his father, Marshal Li. Even if he is in fact the #1 figure in the federal military, he definitely doesn't have the ability to make the entire federal forces go crazy and have the prestige to dance with it. When facing the president and the government, I always feel like he doesn't have too many perfect methods to handle things. If he is slightly careless, he can only leave behind a black name in the annals of history, but there is no way for him to obtain absolute power in this world. That's right. Just like how you are worried about Sulu, this little guy's unreasonable self-confidence, for me Li Jiedu's overly abnormal and shoddy killing, as well as his completely opposite self-confidence, is something that I am extremely puzzled about. Lady Tai's eyes drooped slightly, as if she was thinking about some very troublesome problem. With my understanding of the Lees of Philadelphia, the old man's son is definitely not stupid to this extent. In fact, the things that have happened recently have already proven his ability. Zhou sighed softly and said, could it be that blind optimism really is an emotion that can infect each other? But the problem is that history is heavy. He can allow people like Sulu to be naive, but he definitely won't allow Lee Jae-do to have the possibility of being childish. History is heavy. This seems to be a topic of discussion during an afternoon tea back then? Lady Tai looked at her and said with a smile. Zhou Yu smiled reservedly, and then suddenly narrowed her eyes and asked, Madam, you are concerned about their victory or defeat. Does that mean that you won't get involved in this chaotic battle? If possible, may I know which side you are inclined to support? Lee Jae-do and those people in the army wanted to kill your older brother Crown Prince back then. Naturally, I won't support them. Lady Tai calmly replied, but back then I could even ignore Macklin, so naturally, I can also ignore these old grudges. After all, I have to admit that regardless of whether it is Lee Jae-do or those who stand on his side, they have enough qualifications to discuss matters related to benefits and compensation with me. Zhou Yu listened quietly, not saying a word. I won't support anyone, and I won't use benefits as a bargaining chip at this moment. I just need to quietly watch and see who wins in the end, and then ask them to cut a piece for me. This analogy might be a bit vulgar, but you know that I like to cook in the kitchen. Lady Tai said with a smile. Zhou Yu suddenly laughed, slightly raising her proud chin, and said softly, Madam, in my opinion, the so-called quietly watching should be the biggest mistake that the 7 great families have made in these years. Lady Tai's expression froze slightly. When those soldiers tried to kill my older brother Crown Prince in Linhai State Gymnasium, although the elders of the other families personally went to the back of Macho's mountain to explain and even shed tears to beg for your approval, in fact, everyone knew that they were gloating. They didn't do anything specific, they just watched. When the previous government carried out the Macklin project, the 7 great families still didn't do anything. You watched as Macklin messed up the Federation, and you only came out to clean up the mess in the end, trying to obtain a decisive victory. However, you didn't expect that Su Lu and Shi Qinghai directly killed that old senator, and the Bureau of Proclamation even found out that Macklin was actually a spy for the Empire. And recently, the radicals of the government and the military joined hands. They even sent information to the Empire's military department to kill Commander Zhong and his wife in Constellation. Then, the government began to vigorously harvest the West Woods. During this time, did the other 6 families do anything? No, you didn't do anything. You were still watching and then trying to follow behind the government to take a few bites. Zhou Yu's expression was calm, but there was a hint of her unique biting cold. Even in front of the most terrifying lady in the Federation, her tone was still calm and firm. I don't understand what the legendary 7 great families are thinking. Where did your foresight go? You didn't do anything, you just watched, so now the federal military is basically going to fall into the hands of the radicals. And now, you can't do anything. You can only stare with your eyes wide open and refuse to admit it, but desperately hope that Su Lu can solve these problems. Lady Tai listened quietly. After a moment she smiled slightly and said, Yuzi, I like you more and more, but you have to believe in one thing. For deformed existences like the 7 great families, even if they don't do anything, just watching is enough to deter others. Zhou Yu smiled and shook her head. She said, Madam, I believe that the 72 years of history of the constitutional era will definitely be written by people like Shi Qinghai and Su Lu who do things. The Charter Square was empty and quiet in the middle of the night. The terrorist attack on Parliament Hill a few days ago had raised the security level of the square by 2 levels. In the dark corners and in the old multi-story buildings on both sides of the square, there were countless police and special task force surveillance teams hidden. For Su Lu, these were not obstacles. The members of Group 7 were divided into 3 teams to hide in the forest behind the Windy Slope Club. Under the cover of the glory of the Charter, he quietly passed through the forest and came to the back of the president's official residence. Just as Zhou Yu said, people like him and Shi Qinghai were the most typical people of action. In the end, the so-called plan still had 2 sides, to be arrested or to arrest others, to be killed or to kill others. He had to enter the president's official residence to implement this plan. Most importantly, he had to ensure the safety of Mr. Pabre under the threat of the radicals in the military. Under the precise coordination of the Federal Central Computer, the 3-level electronic surveillance network of the Federation allowed Su Lu to quietly invade with great comfort. There was no groaning and no one was alarmed. Then, under the nervous gaze of Miss Federation, Su Lu climbed into the boudoir of the first daughter of the Federation. He looked apologetically at the trampled quilt. The two whispered for a moment, and then he came to the president's study. Chapter 751. For the social system of the Federation, 5 years was a complete cycle. This was the political environment decided by the election. As for the dark-skinned president sitting behind the desk, with his outstanding governing ability and wisdom, his increasingly mature and natural political methods, as well as his deeply rooted resume, he had now obtained unprecedented support from the federal citizens. He didn't need to worry about the results of this year's presidential election. The so-called 5 years was just a normal occurrence. The silver frost in his eyes and hair could only prove that President Pabre had put in a lot of effort and care in order for the Federation to go further and obtain the final victory in the war with the Empire. 5 years ago, Taizian arranged a scene for Su Lu at the Double Moon Festival Ball in Yue University. Without knowing, Su Lu arranged for the legendary Chao Chodao from Green Dragon Mountain to meet with Taiyan. Together with Shi Qinghai, they indirectly facilitated the visit of Pabre, who was still a member of parliament at that time, to Green Dragon Mountain. This set a firm tone for that extremely intense presidential election. In the blink of an eye, 5 years had passed. Looking at the president behind the desk, deep in thought, Su Li's heart was still as calm and filled with joy and satisfaction as before. He was the first president of the Federation who was truly from the poor class. He came from an ordinary family of miners in Donglin. He used to be the most famous public interest lawyer in the Federation. For the sake of justice and victory for the common people, he fought to the end against those terrifying enterprises and families in the Federation. After winning the election, he chose a path that was completely different from the dark political manipulations of the past. He was more direct and passionate with a clear and calm style. He never made ugly compromises for the sake of the overall situation. He had already proven that he was a real politician, not a politician. Just like what Shi Qinghai said when he raised his glass to celebrate in the bar, Pabre, he is our president. The we here refers to ordinary Federation people like you and me. The headquarters of the 1st Military Region requested to discipline you, but the proposal was suppressed by the Ministry of National Defense. Speaking of which, when are you going to marry Minister Zhou's daughter? Or are you really going to marry that national girl? When President Pabre saw Su Lu standing out from the shadows, he didn't show any surprise on his face. He stood up with a gentle smile, turned off the platform in front of him, and took out 2 cups. Colonel Su Lu, you are a young hero of the Federation. I don't want your messy love life to be imitated by those male students in Lin Hai, who are obviously over-secreting hormones. What do you want to drink? Coffee, tea, or wine? Tea, thank you, Su Lu replied. Although he had already confirmed that Mr. President's safety was not a problem through the old man, when he saw the dark and steady face behind the desk, Su Lu really relaxed. If the military radicals really took crazy measures under pressure and hurt Mr. President, he really didn't know what the Federation would be like tomorrow. President Pabre always seemed very casual when interacting with the staff in his official residence. He looked like an ordinary leader of a work group, without a trace of the president's self-awareness. But in front of Su Lu, this kind of casual expression was very natural and full. It seemed that in the depths of his heart, he had always regarded this outstanding young man as his own nephew. Probably because of the inherent thinking habits of his childhood, Su Lu couldn't really be calm and natural when facing Mr. President. No matter how strong he became, the middle-aged man in front of him from Donglin was after all the president of the Federation, and he was the kind of president that deserved to be respected and followed. Holding a slightly hot cup of ordinary jasmine tea that was brewed by Mr. President himself, Su Lu didn't waste too much time. After confirming that the monitoring equipment in the study was turned off, he used the fastest speed to describe the problems found in the case of the antique bell. President Pabre listened in silence. His thick lips were tightly closed, and his thick straight eyebrows were slightly wrinkled. Whether it was when he heard that the Bureau of Proclamation indirectly provided the charter network to the Imperial Military Headquarters, or when he heard that Colonel Laker secretly destroyed the escape system of the antique bell, there was no expression on his dark face. There were so many people in the Federation government who cooperated with the radicals in the military, and even his partner, the vice president of the Federation, was involved. Perhaps this kind of terrible and sad impact made Mr. President forcibly suppress his anger into intense pain under his calm face. Sulu took out the chip and put it on the table in front of Mr. President. He said in a low voice, "This is the relevant evidence, mainly found by Shi Qinghai. It should be enough to accuse those people." President Pabre didn't take the chip. He casually leaned against the big wooden bookshelf, held the teacup, and said with a heavy expression, "The official residence has received this evidence on the day of the Parliament Hill incident." He put the teacup on the table, and his deep voice was full of undisguised admiration. "Shi Qinghai is a very excellent man. I pardoned him at your request and appointed him as the liaison officer despite everyone's opposition. Now it seems that I made the right choice. He didn't let me down." Sulu just realized that Mr. President had already received the evidence. He was more and more convinced that his judgment was correct. Under the strong pressure of the radicals in the federal military, the official residence really needed the impact from the outside world, or the pressure of public opinion. From the concert in Linhai 5 years ago, to the assassination of Zhong Huiyan, Commander Zhong's daughter, and then to the explosion of the antique bell, the whole thing is very clear. The radicals in the military have been planning for a long time. They are very powerful, but this is not worrying. However, General Li Jiedu actually played such an important role in the radicals, which really makes me feel shocked and uneasy. Sulu looked at the solemn Mr. President and said, "When General Miller retired, Minister Zhou and even many people, including the Army God, thought that it was the best choice for him to take over the position of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because everyone knows that he is famous for being a moderate in the academic faction. I really didn't expect." President Pabre frowned and walked to the window, with a bitter smile on his lips. "I was the one who proposed this motion. There is one more thing that I have been thinking about. When did Teacher Du Xiaoqing join forces with the radicals? Or was he in this organization from the beginning? I really find it hard to believe that he was involved in the explosion of the antique bell." Sulu followed Mr. President's footsteps and walked to the window. Looking at his thick back, he said with deep confusion, "Everyone in the army knows that he and Commander Zhong are lifelong enemies. He and his Iron 7 division were even forcibly suppressed by Commander Zhong for more than 10 years. But, according to my understanding on the battlefield over the years, although Xiaoqing's temperament is very bastardly and indifferent in some aspects, he really doesn't look like a guy who would shoot in the back. Young man, don't you think what we need to do now is to solve the problem, instead of thinking about the root cause of the problem?" President Pabre stood by the window, looked at him and said with a smile, "I believe you already have your own plan. What do you need me to do?" Sulu shrugged clumsily, trying to look relaxed and natural. He replied, "I am your subordinate, so of course I will cooperate with you. Tomorrow there will be some news on the civilian network, and then the Capital Special District Daily will publish a related report. I will use this report to ask for an explanation from the 1st Military Region, and also ask the court to continue the investigation of Colonel Lake's treason case." President Pabre continued calmly, "As the report goes deeper and the evidence is gradually released, I can ask the Ministry of Justice to officially start an investigation. There is nothing that can stop this. Except for guns and ammunition, nothing can stop the investigation." Sulu said, "And now this is what I am most worried about. In fact, these days some of the staff in the official residence are worried about me like you. And I think these seemingly powerful threats are actually just snow stains in the early spring night. They can't see the sun the next day. No matter how cold the snow is, it can only melt under the sun." President Pabre's voice was low and powerful. "The army is the army of the Federation. Its duty is to obey orders. When any soldier joins the army, they have to swear allegiance to the elected government and the President of the Federation, who is the specific representative of this right, which is me." The most powerful man in the Federation looked calmly into Sulu's eyes and said, "I don't believe that the entire federal forces are made up of ambitious people. Even if some officers are blinded by profit, ordinary soldiers will not stand on their side. Without my order, no army can enter within 80 kilometers of the capital special district. I agree with your point of view." General Li Jiedu may be able to convince many troops, but he can't convince every specific person, so he can only use other names to carry out hidden operations. Sulu nodded and replied, Mr. President, I promise you, as long as they begin to mobilize troops, I may be able to find a way to slow down the advancement of the mechanized troops. Thinking of that damn Federal Central Computer that stubbornly analyzed the specific situation every time, Sulu silently cursed a few times in his heart. Then he scratched his head and said, even if I can't, I can directly arrest or kill General Li Jiedu before the situation escalates. Hearing this, President Pabre's eyebrows slightly raised. He looked at him seriously and asked, this is not the time for jokes. Are you sure you can do it? At least a 50% success rate. Sulu silently calculated in his heart, but he didn't say it out loud. With a sincere smile that easily made people feel a sense of trust, he looked at President Pabre and said, please rest assured. President Pabre was silent for a long time. Then he shook his head with a smile and patted him on the shoulder. At that time, Parliament Hill was preparing to hold a special hearing on the matter of you being the student of that traitor. Now that I think about it, it should have been Byron's plan. Byron. I've known him for many years. He was very good at these kinds of political tactics on the surface. I have to admit that he was excellent. In many important moments, I even relied on his maturity and a little cunning to deal with the situation. Now that he's dead, I feel very complicated when I think about it occasionally. President Pabre and Sulu both held teacups and stood side by side in front of the window on the second floor of the official residence. In front of them was the lawn, and further away was the street. At the end of the street was Charter Square. The view was incomparably wide, and there was no danger of being sniped. The president laughed self-deprecatingly. He picked up the teacup and took a sip without knowing the taste. He continued, it was because of that incident that they uncovered your secret, or rather your background. Only then did I know that you were also from Donglin. Actually, I was very happy to know that you were also a rock from Donglin. I was gratified and even a little happy. President Pabre glanced at him and laughed loudly. Sulu looked at him and replied with a smile, when I found out that you were from Donglin, I believe that many Donglin people felt the same as me when I thought that a Donglin person would become the president of the Federation. We all felt very proud. The Donglin region was extremely remote. Since the crystal mines had dried up, it had become even more desolate. It had gradually become a corner forgotten by the Federation. The citizens of Donglin all looked forward to leaving that planet with no obvious changes in the seasons, and no clear view of the beautiful starry sky. However, it was very difficult to enter the capital ring through immigration or examinations. The quota provided by the Federation was extremely limited. However, with Pabre being elected as the president of the Federation and Suli's identity being exposed, there was an extremely subtle change. This pair of Donglin men, who were quite a few years apart in age, had already become the two most famous men in the Federation. The citizens of the capital ring naturally remembered the Donglin region again, as well as the especially famous Donglin Roksang. The Federation government, on the other hand, increased their support and immigration to the Donglin region. My wife returned to Donglin on my behalf at the beginning of the year. President Pabre said, you probably don't know how proud the people back home are of us. Sulu smiled. He suddenly sank into silence. He looked at the starry sky outside the window and said faintly, my hometown can't see such a beautiful starry sky. I can't change this, even if I'm the president of the Federation. It's said that the president of the Federation is the most powerful man in this galaxy, but no one knows that even if the president of the Federation wants to do something sometimes, it's very difficult to make even the slightest change in this galaxy. President Pabre looked at Sulu with an unusually solemn expression. He said, it's really difficult to do things. There were countless agents of the Special Task Force hiding in the corners of the lawn outside the French windows. After the incident on Parliament Hill, the major organizations of the Federation increased their security levels. The security measures in places like the president's official residence were naturally extremely tight. In the rooms downstairs, the staff of the official residence were busy with their daily work. The rooms at the end of the left and right corridors were a different scene. There were many special forces soldiers with cold expressions. They silently lined up together like statues. They were fully armed to the teeth, and the guns in their hands glowed with a cold light. In Su Li's left eye, the armed forces inside and outside the official residence were like countless dense dots of light. Through these soldiers who belonged to the security forces directly under the capital garrison, he could clearly feel the pressure that the president had been under these days. "Mr. President, the people will understand you," he said comfortingly. President Pabre looked at him. After a moment he said, "It's good that you can understand." Sulu sat silently on the sofa in the study on the second floor of the official residence. His hands held the cup of tea that had already become slightly cold. He waited for the president next door to come over with the secret authorization document that was going to be given to him. He was a very patient person. Otherwise, he wouldn't have liked mechanical repair work that was extremely boring in the eyes of ordinary people. However, he didn't know if it was because the taste of the undrunk jasmine tea evaporated too quickly, or because the leather sofa, a cultural relic left behind by the previous dynasty, was too soft. It was only a moment, but it felt like an eternity to him. He continued to sit. He sat alone. He sat more and more alone, and it was getting colder and colder. Sulu narrowed his eyes. He looked at the dots of light that were scattered in various areas of the official residence in his left eye. He looked at the changes in the situation in the buildings around Charter Square further away. He suddenly remembered something that the president had just said. "Without my order, no troops can enter within an 80-kilometer radius of the capital's special district." The troops that suddenly appeared in the streets and alleys were definitely less than 80 kilometers away from the president's official residence. The closest one was not even 800 meters away. He raised his head and silently looked at the heavy wooden door between the study and the confidential room next door. He confirmed that the president was on the other side of the door and didn't leave. He frowned and licked his dry lips. Through the communication system next to his collar, he sent the latest order to the members of Group 7 who were waiting outside the official residence. "All of you." After pausing for 2 seconds, his brows furrowed tighter and tighter. He continued in a soft voice, "Retreat immediately. If you encounter an abnormal situation, don't resist. I repeat, don't resist, and then this is an order." After finishing what he had to do immediately, Sulu stood up and put the cup of jasmine tea back on the desk. He quickly walked to the window and narrowed his eyes to observe the situation in the lawn and the dark night. Then with a whoosh, he forcefully closed all the thick curtains. The starry sky outside the window was covered, but the light in the study was brighter. The truth and falsehood of the light didn't affect the lighting effect. He quickly walked to the door of the study near the corridor. He narrowed his eyes and saw the scene behind the door. He couldn't help but smile self-deprecatingly. He turned around and pulled off the belt on the bookcase. He forcefully locked the door and then subconsciously shook his head. After doing all this, Sulu sat back on the uncomfortable leather sofa again. He rested his elbows on his thighs and thoughtfully stared at the wooden door that didn't open for a long time. It really didn't take long, but it felt very long, he said to himself in his heart. Feeling was really a terrible thing because feelings were the best at deceiving people. Sulu shook his head and took out a 37 brand cigarette from his jacket pocket. He tiredly leaned against the back of the sofa. The fingers of his right hand holding the lighter were slightly trembling, just like the extremely complicated feelings at this moment. Chapter 752. It was already late at night. The bustling Charter Square and the bustling Parliament Hill had become incomparably quiet. Only the group of 5 in the middle of the square were still sizing up their new comrade, puzzled as to why the god of war looked so old. Occasionally, a gust of wind would blow past, causing the green leaves on the ground to roll slowly. Because it was late spring, there was no feeling of desolation, but there was no joy or warmth either. The sudden sound of emergency brakes came from under the specially made bulletproof tires of dozens of dark green military vehicles, piercing through the silent night sky. Then the rumbling sound of armored vehicles blended into the sound, waking the rich people around the square from their dreams. Some people walked to the window in confusion and looked at the armored vehicles and military vehicles that were quickly dispersing around the square. They watched as the densely packed, fully armed soldiers quickly rushed into many important buildings, including the Ministry of Finance. They couldn't help but be shocked. This was the capital's special district, and shocking scenes rarely happened. What was going on? What did this troop of unknown origin want to do? In a short period of time, a large screen appeared above a military vehicle in the middle of the troop. The words "drill" were silently displayed on the screen. At the same time, many soldiers began to enter the building to explain to the panicked people. It turned out that this was a special military drill in response to the attack on Parliament Hill. Of course, this was not a military drill. When the members of Group 7 scattered around the presidential residence received Su Li's order through the communication system, they knew that there was going to be a big problem today. Gu Shifeng frowned and combed her sweat-soaked hair with her chubby fingers. She didn't know how to respond to the leader's order. After receiving the order, the communication system automatically shut down. They didn't know if Su Lu was still in the presidential residence, nor did they know what had happened to him. What should we do? Xiong Linquan's buzzing voice sounded from the system. It was an exceptionally violent and impatient voice. Should we storm into the residence and take a look? Don't you think it's a little too difficult for us to storm the president's residence with just 20 people? Gu Shifeng mocked, then frowned and said, "Let's retreat. This is the leader's order." Retreat again? Withdraw my ass. The angry voices of the members of Team 7 could be heard from the communication system. Someone said in a low voice, "Every time we are about to fight, the boss always wants us to retreat and take over the work himself. That time in 3320, that time in the Empire. What the fuck, are we really useless shit-stirrers?" Gu Shifeng understood the feelings of her team members. Everyone knew that Su Lu would abandon his team members to play the role of a lone hero, because he was worried that something would happen to his team members. However, no one could accept that they couldn't help Su Lu. "Boss doesn't like to play with us. What can we do?" He was hiding in the bathroom on the second-last floor of the Ministry of Finance building. He was in charge of communication with the entire team. After a slight pause, he returned to his role as the temporary commander and said in a deep voice, "Everyone, quickly retreat. I repeat, quickly retreat from your current positions. Remember, this is an order." A soldier's duty was to obey orders, so the federal forces had to listen to Mr. President's orders. However, for Team 7, Su Lu and Bai Yulan's orders were irresistible. Therefore, no matter how angry, worried, and unwilling they were, the team members still used the fastest speed to pack up their equipment and prepare to retreat from their positions. At this time, Gu Shifeng, who was destroying the 24-hour electronic data, heard the screeching sound of brakes coming from the ground. Through the window of the bathroom, he saw the endless stream of troops coming from the streets. His eyes narrowed, and he finally understood why Su Lu ordered them to retreat first. Of course, this was not a drill. This was a standard military operation. In the face of more than 2,000 elite soldiers of the Federation, as well as those heavy firepower armored vehicles that were ready to attack in the night, no matter how strong Group 7 was, they were just a small wooden boat in front of a huge wave. How could they resist? Gu Shifeng stared at the Federation soldiers charging toward the Ministry of Finance building. Suddenly, he pointed at the metal button on his left sleeve and said in a deep voice, "I repeat boss's order again. No resistance. No resistance." This was a secret military operation with an extremely high level of confidentiality. This military operation mobilized the 3rd Military Region's Iron 7th Division, the Capital Garrison Division's 2nd Division, and the 1st Regiment's elite and loyal troops. Before the operation began, only the highest military officers of these 3 troops knew the specific details of tonight's operation. This secret military operation relied entirely on verbal orders. There were no radio calls or electronic files. The troops didn't even activate the military command system, nor did they use the mechas. Even the remote control systems and chips in the armored vehicles and military vehicles were completely dismantled. There were no orders in the air, no electrical noises unique to the command system. There were only standard field hand gestures and manual light screen adjustments. More than 1,000 Federation troops, like a black mass of silent ghosts, quickly took control of all the passages around the president's official residence. Sporadic gunshots came from the southwest corner, and then it quickly returned to silence. A staff officer in the army suppressed his strong puzzlement and doubts about the military operation, and quickly ran to a military vehicle on the street. He lowered his body and said, "We have captured 8 illegal armed soldiers, which is 14 less than the plan. We are still searching for them. I don't know why, but none of the captured soldiers resisted. Also, the Capitol Police Bureau has sent officers over. The Ministry of National Defense is asking us what we are doing." The car window slowly rolled down, revealing Du Xiaoqing's expressionless and extremely cold face. He looked at the Charter Square in the night and didn't care about the questions from the Capitol Police Bureau and the Ministry of National Defense. He gently pinched the leg of his sunglasses and asked, "What was that gunshot just now?" A member of the 7th group tried to escape by jumping over the wall, and was shot in the leg by the sniper of the first group of guards. "Is he okay?" "It's not a big problem." "Not bad." Du Xiaoqing pushed open the door and walked out. He said, "I still insist that those guys can't be considered real soldiers. But during the war with the Empire, those guys have proven their combat strength. The troops need them alive. Since they didn't resist, pay attention to their personal safety." "Yes, sir." The staff officer looked at the commander who was walking in the direction of the president's official residence, and shook his head in confusion. After finishing the cigarette, Su Lu lit another one. Watching the flame gradually spread over the 3 words, Su Li's eyes narrowed. He took it in front of him and carefully examined it, as if he was trying to find a secret that he couldn't understand no matter how much he thought about it. Time ticked by, but no one pushed open the door of the study, which was next to the corridor. Only the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard faintly. Sitting on the sofa, he stared at the burning 37 brand cigarette, shook his head, and cursed a few vulgarities about Didi. Without the old man's help, Su Lu could accurately judge that the soldiers outside the door must be fully armed. They wore hard bulletproof vests, heavy transparent bulletproof helmets, and held dangerous high firepower guns in their hands. The door between the study and the confidential room was also not opened. The most powerful man in the Federation was behind the door. Su Lu licked his dry lips, stuffed the cigarette butt into his mouth and took a deep breath. He knew that he could not rush through the door. As for the door behind him, outside the window to his left, the lawn around the official residence was already occupied by hundreds of the Federation's most elite Special Forces soldiers. If he really dared to rush, then what greeted him would be countless bullets. Previously, he had thought that the elite Special Forces in the official residence, which belonged to the security forces directly under the capital garrison, were special measures used by Mr. President to protect him. Only now did he know that they were special measures used to arrest or kill him. This was really ridiculous and hilarious. But Su Lu could not laugh. He felt as if he had returned to the abandoned mine pits in Donglin. Looking at the huge rock in front of him that was piled up by the mining machine to the wastewater outlet, his mood was irritable and gloomy. Because of this mood, he just stared blankly at the Federal Central Computer that constantly displayed the firepower layout around the official residence in his left eye. He looked at the precise electronic map that showed the troops that had already controlled all the streets and alleys, but he did not have any conversation with it. Once here, he carefully put out the cigarette butt and counted the number of people he would see. Then, using the chip positioning provided by the Federal Central Computer, he confirmed that the second one had also arrived. So, he silently said in his heart, "Open the door." The door between the study and the confidential room opened. To be precise, it should be that the door, together with the large bookshelf full of books and the wall behind it, quietly opened and disappeared into the thick wall. A transparent glass wall appeared between the two rooms. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked over there. He knew that this could not be a real glass wall, but a high-strength composite security wall. He had read the information beforehand and knew that the security measures inside the official residence were very strong. At that time, he was relieved for Mr. President's safety, but now he trapped himself. This transparent wall was thicker, more indestructible, and more infuriating than the wall that blocked in front of him in the Four States Foundation building. It separated him and the people behind the wall into two different worlds. At this time, anger and disappointment were a wall. He was on one side and President Pabre was on the other side. On the second day after the funeral of God of War Li Pifu, Li Jedu stood up straight and participated in a secret meeting of the Trinity Association. In that meeting, facing the members' proposal to let Zhou Yingxing resign from the position of Minister of Defense, the Vice President of the Federation, Byron, once showed strong confidence and demanded that all action should be based on the fundamental interests of the Federation. At that time he smiled and said, "We are the Federation." In the luxurious washroom of the Parliament building, which was full of the aura of death and torture, Shi Qinghai once asked Shi Minjin, if that Mr. Senator was not Byron, then who was it? Shi Minjin, who was bleeding non-stop, looked at him and laughed nervously. She asked him mockingly, "Do you and Sulu know who your enemy is? Do you know who we are?" On the shining emblem of the Federation on the building of the Ministry of Defense, Sulu once seriously and solemnly reminded Du Shaoqing that as a soldier of the Federation, his duty was to obey orders. Du Shaoqing's expression was very complicated and strange at that time. He said that he knew. Yes, he did know, and he had always done so. The answer was revealed. It was not pleasant, and it was somewhat sad for a long time. There was silence in the president's residence. No one spoke. Only the suffocating heavy breathing of the soldiers could be faintly heard through the walls. President Pabre looked at Sulu through the glass wall and was silent for a long time. He slowly held his forehead with his broad palm, as if the decision he was about to make was extremely difficult for him. Li Jedu stood behind him with a gentle and calm expression as usual. Du Shaoqing stood at the door farther away. It was unknown when he had put on his sunglasses again, but there was no trace of expression on his face. President Pabre's tan face was slightly firm. He said slowly, "At the press conference in the afternoon, you said to the camera that you were back. You asked if we were ready. I was very worried about you." He shook his head and said with emotion, "I was worried that you were not mentally prepared enough to face all of this." Sulu looked at Pabre's face very seriously. He felt very strange. Why was it that at this time, there was still no way to see any sense of insincerity on his face? So he remained silent, wanting to hear what the other party wanted to say. "For so many years you are the young man I admire the most." President Pabre's voice passed through the transparent wall. It was still so deep and powerful, and seemed particularly sincere and firm. He looked at Sulu with unwavering eyes and said in a deep voice, "At this time, there is no need for any deception between us. You can believe this without hesitation. No matter what kind of suffering and pain you have experienced, you still have innocence and hot-bloodedness in the depths of your bones. And this kind of naked beautiful trust is very rare." Sulu suddenly opened his mouth without warning. He frowned and looked at the people on the other side of the transparent wall. It was unknown whether he was asking them or asking himself. Naive is the synonym for stupid? I just told a friend this afternoon that as long as I don't force myself into a dead end, no one can catch or kill me now. Then I realized that because I was afraid of you dying, I really foolishly forced myself into a dead end. There was no obvious expression on Suli's face. His fingers gently rubbed the extinguished butt of his cigarette. He shook his head and said, "I don't understand. How did I suddenly become a stupid cunt? And the reason for becoming a stupid cunt is actually so fucked up. Just like those deliberately mystifying novels of Schiller's in the late period. Why is it that the most righteous old man would finally tear off his mask and proudly tell the whole world that he is the worst one?" His straight black eyebrows were furrowed so tightly that they were forcibly twisted into two question marks. He looked at the still dark and steady face of the president behind the wall and shook his head. "This is not right. This is not pretty. You have to at least let people feel that this world is still a little bit bright, right? The president of the Federation, the vice president, the senior senator, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the invincible general of a generation. Yes, you are the Federation, you are the army." Suli's face was full of self-mockery. Then he suddenly stood up and raised his voice, roaring angrily toward the other side of the wall. "But what kind of shitty Federation and army is this? Chapter 753. For Sulu, his world had reached its most dangerous moment. This kind of danger had nothing to do with life and death. It was only related to the collapse of something. Therefore, he was forced to let out an angry roar. But this roar was definitely not his final groan. After returning from Sunset Province in the West Woods, he went to the Charter Square to look at the candlelight. He went to the hospital to look for a nurse to fulfill Mr. Sher's last wish. He went to the tomb to be silent. He and Zoyu ate barbecue on the street. They were silent and relaxed. Unexpectedly, he did not go crazy. The reason for this was that he was very confident in this world. When the glory of the Charter was on his shoulders, when the President of the Federation was in his official residence, no matter how evil and dark the forces were, they were actually just a bunch of clowns to Sulu. In the end, he realized how pathetic he was. He realized that he had been deceiving himself and others. He was actually the saddest clown. If this world could be simply divided into good and bad, he would never have thought that President Pabre was a bad person. The reason why he had such a firm belief was probably because he had never thought, or did not dare to think, or did not want to think at all. He, Shi Qinghai, and many others sincerely wanted to protect this world. It turned out that justice and light would not always prevail in this world. This was also a case of if what they were protecting was justice and light. This was the best era. The Federation finally had its first civilian president. The government in Green Dragon Mountain finally achieved a great reconciliation. Tens of billions of people were motivated and united. The frontline troops were winning one victory after another. But this was also the worst era. The most cold-blooded, ruthless, and dirty political murder. The most ambitious and ruthless plan. The military generals who had guarded the western border for the Federation for many years were ruthlessly sold out to the Empire's fleet. And the people who planned all this were the most important people in the Federation's government and army. It was actually the president who was infinitely loved by the people. Sulu silently looked at the solemn face of the president behind the transparent wall. He thought of many things in a very short time. He vaguely realized that the president did not kill him immediately. Instead, he took the risk to stay and have a face-to-face talk with him. What kind of talk would they have later? What should he insist on? I should probably persevere. Would he say, "Is what you think justice is justice?" These questions could be analyzed in detail. There was no conclusion to the debate. But just like last year in the Empire's White Courtyard, I conducted a psychological analysis of the princess. I am not a moralist. I am a selfish youth who seeks the meaning of life and happiness. What I have defended and will defend is not morality and justice but what I think is right. Since that is the case, I will naturally persevere and stubbornly continue to be selfish. Only in this way can I be happy. Suli's thoughts, which were moving at a high speed like the chaotic particles erupting from the crystal engine of a space battleship, flashed through his mind in an extremely stimulating manner, causing him to feel waves of pain between his eyebrows. Then, miraculously, he quickly calmed down, and there was not a trace of anger on his somewhat wooden face. Mr. President, just now, the two of us were looking at the starry sky above our heads by the window and talking about the hometown of Donglin. Sulu gently stroked the bracelet on his left wrist with his right hand behind his back. He recalled the words signed by Kant on the surface of the bracelet. The beautiful rain seemed to know that it was not a good time. It quietly sneaked into the clouds and came to the ground. It kindly moistened the dry and cold air in the room between the men who were hugging each other. In the soft sound of the rain, President Pabre was silent for a moment. He pursed his thick lips and said in a loud voice that was slightly tired and hoarse, "How a person should live their life is a question that everyone has to think about. When I was young and looked at the dark sky above my head on the slag heap of Donglin, the dream I could hold was to get rid of this planet that made it hard to breathe, go to the capital ring to study and work, and then get the immigration quota." Sulu listened in silence. His right hand tightly grasped the right pillow of the sofa. He remembered that his dream was to become a warship mechanic or to work in the capital ring's motor company. As time passed, his original dream now seemed so quiet and humble. The story told by the president was very simple. At the beginning, it answered the biggest question in Suli's heart. If the terrorist radical organization that had been secretly planned for decades and finally gradually controlled the government and the army was the evil design of the geniuses from the Trinity Association, then President Pabre came from the Donglin region. His life experience seemed to have no connection with the Capital University-affiliated high school and the first military academy of the Federation. Why was he involved in such a huge plan? Why were so many geniuses in the Trinity Association willing to shed blood for him, take the blame for him and block bullets and rumors for him to become the real #1 person in the Federation? That tavern was called Santa Fe. I heard that it was a religious brand from Bermuda. At that time I only had about 200 Federation coins, but when I passed by that tavern, I still couldn't help but go in and have a drink. Li Jiedu stood aside with a smile and slowly added, Santa Fe is most famous for the religious blood wine that was smuggled from Bermuda. Yes, that was what I drank at that time. When President Pabre talked about this past, he couldn't help but laugh loudly. He waved his broad palm in front of him and said, In the end, I drank too much and spent all of my 200 Federation coins. That was half a month's rent for you and your sister-in-law, Li Jiedu said. At that time, because of the pollution case of Shika Pharmaceutical Company, I was fired from the law firm for the first time. My wife and I carried boxes and wandered everywhere. It was rare for me to borrow half a month's rent. I shouldn't have gone to the tavern to get drunk, but I always thought that I continued to do the right thing. Speaking of this, President Pabre's thick eyebrows furrowed. This unpleasant memory had now become a kind of spiritual wealth, but he still didn't forget the impulse and the unique grief and anger of a young man when he stepped into that tavern. He turned his head and stared into Su Li's eyes silently. He said, Since I did the right thing, why was I only able to live in a small dark room for 400 Federation coins a month? The inflation in those 2 years was very high. The conditions of a small dark room for 400 Federation coins were indeed very poor. Li Jiedu shook his head and added with a smile, while Du Xiaoqing, who was standing at the door, still had an indifferent expression on his face and didn't take off his sunglasses. President Pabre looked into Su Li's eyes and said calmly, Santa Fe is outside the west gate of Capital University, and the first military academy is just 1 street away. A poor lawyer in dire straits didn't dare to go home because he drank all the rent that his wife needed the most, so he could only stay in the tavern and look for opportunities to pick up money on the ground. Of course, this is a joke. Li Jiedu smiled warmly and said to the president, You're a bit emotional today. Let me explain. He looked at Su Lu and said calmly, At the time, the Trinity Association was having a meeting in the tavern. Byron, I, and a few of the current middle-aged people and even the old people, as well as the young people back then, were caught in a fierce argument about the political, economic, and history of the Federation. You know, those who are qualified to enter the Trinity Association have enough right to be proud. They all have their own views about the world, and no one can convince the other. But we basically came to a consensus. If the Federation is to continue to develop the 7 great families, these abnormal existences must be eliminated. Li Jiedu's eyes drooped slightly, and he said softly with a smile, This is the wild imagination of the young people, but you have to allow the young people the right to be wild. But how to do it? We began to quarrel fiercely again. The quarrels of so-called geniuses sometimes often fall into a state of fantasy. At the time, we didn't have the courage to pick up guns and go to war with those families and politicians. We just liked to quarrel, and through quarreling we found some kind of courageous pleasure. At this time, in the corner of the Santa Fe Tavern, a drunkard suddenly stood up. His skin was dark and he reeked of alcohol. I don't know when he heard our discussion, but he directly pushed open the door to the private room and looked at us, this group of proud people, and started cursing. It only took him half an hour to convince all the proud members of the association, including me. If we want the Federation to go in the right direction and want to eliminate the 7 great families, then we must seize politics and the power above politics at all costs. That is, the power of violence. After that, everything started in a small tavern called the Santa Fe Tavern. Chapter 754. Joining the Trinity Association required extremely harsh conditions. Just by thinking about the amazing Shi Hai, one could probably agree with what President Pabre had said earlier. The people who drank lightly in the tavern definitely had a superhuman IQ and extraordinary abilities. In short, they were indeed a group of abnormal geniuses. An unemployed, tanned lawyer who had just been fired from a law firm and wandered the streets in the snowy winter of the capital, drinking until he was dead drunk, actually used less than half an hour to successfully convince this group of abnormal geniuses and make them really start to carry out this seemingly crazy long-term plan. This was a historical event that not many people knew about for the time being, but it would probably be firmly recorded in history books. Seems so incredible. This is probably the charisma that Shi Hai once talked about, Sulu thought silently. His right hand tightly gripped the armrest of the leather relic sofa. His fingers felt the cool and smooth touch, and his mood was extremely complicated. Silently looking at the dark-skinned middle-aged man behind the transparent wall, Su Li's thick eyebrows furrowed tightly. Why was the gaze in this man's eyes always so calm and deep, giving people a feeling of trust? Why did his straight eyebrows look so calm? Why was his expression so normal, but people could always see the compassion hidden inside? Was it because he deeply loved the Federation and this starry sky? What a valiant actor! Well, no matter how much people ridiculed him in their hearts, this middle-aged man really had a special quality that could persuade and move people around him. He could influence people around him to stand by his side and bravely and arrogantly move forward towards an uncertain goal. For example, the members of the Trinity Association who were having a meeting in the tavern back then, or the cold and proud Du Shaoqing, or the former Su Lu and Shi Hai. There wasn't much in common between the members of the association and Mr. President, except that we were all once in the military. It was just that the military branches and services we served were different. After that, our lives didn't seem to have much in common or connected. General Li Jiedu continued slowly. After that, we met a few more times in the tavern in Santa Fe. However, we all had our own careers and studies, so we separated very quickly. After that day, Mr. Pabre and I sponsored Mr. Pabre to return to the legal world. After strictly abandoning the so-called mental misophobia of the so-called liberals, Mr. Pabre successfully entered the Industrial Workers Association, and then he became the appointed lawyer of the three major unions and the Veterans Association. Byron is a little older. He was the first one of us to run for office and step into the political arena. I still stayed in the army, but according to the plan, I left the frontline field forces and returned to No. 1 hospital to teach and educate people again. In the past 10 years of teaching, I have discovered some very good young talents. I can proudly say that these young people are the key to the true success of our great cause in the future. Su Lu looked at Du Shaoqing, who had been standing by the door. Du Shaoqing remained silent. The sunglasses on the bridge of his nose reflected the light in the confidential room, clear and inexplicable. No, Du Shaoqing entered the association and was able to accept our ideals. It had nothing to do with me. Li Jiedu said. Mr. Pabre personally convinced him. Sulu knew what he should be feeling at this moment. The entire federal forces knew that Mr. President had never concealed his special appreciation and care for two people. Whether it was promotion or related complaints, everything went smoothly under Mr. President's personal care. These two people were Su Lu himself and teacher Du Shaoqing. The fact that there was only one heir for several generations. Sometimes people couldn't help but think that maybe this was some kind of punishment and relief from the heavens for the former royal family. The most powerful Thai family of the 7 families was actually the most fragile Thai family. As long as that young man who was called the Crown Prince died, the Thai family would naturally be depressed until it disappeared. President Pabre narrowed his eyes slightly and said slowly, "As for the election that was going on at the time, I believe that the angry and desperate Lady Thai would continue to help me, no matter if it was to vent her emotions or to strike at the murderer she believed to be." He looked at Su Lu and said, "And this kind of help would spare no effort, regardless of the cost. This also meant that no matter what happened, I would win the presidential election. I always thought that you were a politician, not a politician." After a moment of silence, Su Lu said, Only now do I know that the thing that constantly leaps and bounds in your chest is still the ambition of a politician. It's not ambition. The president didn't get angry. He explained patiently with a smile, if it was only for this so-called ambition, then the things that happened afterwards wouldn't have happened. I am the president of the Federation. General Li Jiedu is the leader of the military. There is also teacher Shaoqing, including the deceased Byron and those companions. The people in the tavern back then, as well as the new companions that joined later on, already stand at the pinnacle of the Federation's power. Without more power to pursue, what ambition can we have? President Pabre looked at Sulu and smiled. His voice was deep and resounding, and it was exceptionally moving. If we really want to talk about ambition, then our ambition is very simple. It is to completely eliminate the 7 families from the social system of the Federation. There is a very interesting statistical fact. After the Federation and the Empire started the war, the first military academy's reputation and importance were pushed to its current position. The Trinity Association naturally appeared about 60 years ago, but it has several dozen members. In terms of probability, it is a bit strange. There are many members who didn't join our ranks. We didn't force them, and we didn't even make any major requests. I just want to remind you that none of these members have the background of one of the 7 families. So-called geniuses are nothing more than high intelligence combined with hard work that ordinary people can't imagine. Those 7 families have long since infiltrated the Federation's society and seized the majority of the top resources. Their children don't need to put in such hard work. The members of the Trinity Association all come from the bottom of society. They innately have the desire and motivation to change this society. President Pabre's expression was solemn. His voice was low and powerful. This system, jointly controlled by the 7 families and politicians, has lasted for 3,772 years since the Federation was established. It has lasted for more than 10,000 years since the collapse of the dynasty and the establishment of the Republic. This system has already become rigid and is in the process of decay. The best era? The worst era? No, the saddest thing is that if you look at the source of history, you will find that all the eras are exactly the same. There is no progress, no development, just a quagmire where everyone is squeezed together and breathing with difficulty. Meanwhile, generation after generation of people with intelligence and creativity will gradually sink into this great quagmire and then die. In the past, there were people who tried to change all of this. For example, those governments that had already been forgotten by the people, for example, that president who was assassinated. President, you kept on going to court to build your reputation, running for parliament, and making those touching but fucking useless speeches. Sulu faced the transparent and cold wall and said with a hoarse voice, "You gave the ancient clock to the Empire's fleet, and you killed him. This is betrayal. This is betrayal." Chapter 755. President Pabre, who was the most eloquent when he was a lawyer, whose speech was the most touching after he participated in politics, and who was still able to speak calmly and clearly at such a moment, finally quieted down for the first time after Suli's question. Between his thick eyebrows, in his exceptionally firm eyes, there was a faint trace of sadness. Was it because he would occasionally think of the fireworks in the Night Scorpion Nebula and feel guilty? Noticing the president's expression, Suli's lips moved slightly. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he could only helplessly and sadly spread out his hands. He had heard the president mention that at the dinner at the official residence, the president and Zhong Sugu had a fierce argument at the dinner table. The two people had very different views on many things regarding the invasion of the empire. Zhong Sugu was wary of the Federation government's attempt to weaken the local military forces in the West Woods, and did not agree that the 4th Military Region should be the main force to attack the empire under the current circumstances. It was probably after this argument that President Pabre finally made up his mind. He officially put the conspiracy plan that had been in motion for a long time, and was only waiting for approval on the stage with space as the backdrop. It turned out that it was a Last Supper. Sulu stood alone on the other side of the transparent wall, his hands weakly spread out beside his body. When he killed Macklin and was locked up in the military prison of Chingcheng, the old man was still fishing in Philadelphia and had never seen him. The entire Federation was silent, and the leaders of the 7 major families wanted him dead immediately. Only the president and the tiger in the Westwoods clearly showed an attitude of protection, but in the end, Mr. President, do you still remember the speech at the Nebula Awards that year? After that, I specially came to look at it. Sulu raised his head and looked at President Pabre behind the wall. He said softly at that time regarding the Macklin incident, "You once said a few words. When a person dies, it is not as good as when the light is extinguished. The light has light, and the place that it cannot illuminate is darkness. If you do something wrong, you must pay the price." Then you said, "Perhaps I'm not a mature politician, but I'm a devoted believer of the Federation's laws. If I die, you can dig up my grave and see what color it is." I have the same attitude toward certain dead people. Silence reigned in the room. Sulu paused for a moment before asking, "You're not dead yet, but it seems that we can ask you in advance. When you decided to sell the lives of Commander Zhong, his wife and the soldiers on the Antique Belle to the Imperial Fleet, where was the law of the Federation that you respected? What color will your future grave be? If you did something wrong, shouldn't you pay the price?" President Pabre pursed his thick lips, his lower jaw showing a few deep hollows. After a long silence he replied, "I admit that I have done some things that are beyond my limits. However, for the sake of this Federation, the price I will have to pay must be paid later. I have long been mentally prepared to be judged by history." Sulu looked at him and said sarcastically, "If we let history judge us, the Imperial Expeditionary Force can also say that we don't need to resist. Medellin can also say that we don't need to pay attention to him. Commander Zhong has more reason to say that." "Mr. President, don't you think that this statement is shameless and hypocritical? If only history is qualified to judge you, then how are you qualified to judge others?" At this point in the conversation, Su Li's words had finally succeeded in infuriating him. He slowly stood up from his chair and walked to the transparent wall. He looked at Sulu, who was right in front of him but far away in the sky, and said word by word, "Sulu, don't worry. Shameless? Hypocritical? Colonel Sulu, please don't forget that you also used the pen that stabbed into your throat to judge Medellin without being convicted by the court." Separated by the transparent and cold wall, Sulu and President Pabre stood face to face. They opened their eyes without blinking and looked into each other's eyes. President Pabre pointed at Suli's face and said with a sullen face, "Your experience should let you know better than most people that the law of the Federation can't perfectly protect the weak. Most of the time, it can only protect the powerful to escape the punishment they deserve. That's why the Medellin case was stopped, and the Ministry of Justice is in a terrible state. That's why you played the role of judge yourself. The government of the Federation is an elected government. Facing the danger of the Empire's invasion, it has to be constantly vigilant against the warlords of the West Woods. Don't the Zhong family and the other families have broken the law? But which district attorney would be able to successfully send them to prison? The Federation has the glory of the Charter, but in front of these powerful people who have countless scapegoats and are even used to carrying scapegoats around with them and responding to the Charter at any time, what is the law?" Sulu looked at the president's angry accusation and narrowed his eyes. Because of the word scapegoat and the glory of the Charter, he thought of the knife glinting on Tiger Mountain Road and the district procuratorate full of peach blossoms in spring many years ago. He silently admitted that what the president said was true. When you killed Medellin, you didn't need the law to prepare for you. What right do you have to ask the government to do so? President Pabre looked at him with a solemn expression and said, "The reason why I admire you and Shi Qinghai is because of your attitude in doing things, and this is also the attitude that I will live with in my life. Evil must pay the price. In order to practice the ultimate fairness and justice, kind people should do whatever it takes, because morality is a fragile thing that needs to be carefully protected by strength. When I was expelled from the law firm because of a public interest lawsuit, and my wife and I were laughed at and chased out of our house, wandering the snowy streets with a broken box, looking for a small dark house to rent, I confirmed this. Even if I were to be buried in a grave in the future, I would have a clear conscience. President Pabre's anger gradually calmed down because of these words. He put his broad palm on the transparent wall and looked at Sulu with extreme calmness. We are not the Knights of Concern in Schiller's words, and we are not radical. We don't plan to use the army to madly sweep everything, but when the reform of the Federation encounters the desperate struggle of those families, the army will be the most powerful protection of the Federation government. We have a very long-term detailed plan. The current government has already pushed the parliament to pass the Golden Fusion algorithm. In the next 5 years, my companions and I will use the current situation of the war to push for the passage of more bills. In the plan, the government and I will introduce the Affirmative Action Act, the Double Ring Health Insurance Act, the Income Tax Amendment Act, and then the government will work hard to pass the Fund Share Exchange Act. President Pabre slightly raised his chin, and his eyes were firm and deep. The previous governments have never been able to figure out how much resources the 7 families control through those foundations that are as numerous as fish in the sea. They can hide from the government's surveillance, and can exert a fatal influence on the industries that are related to the safety of the Federation. These things must be done during my term. George Carlin said that information asymmetry is the root of the unfairness of the Federation society. What we want to do is to open up this information, and let the ordinary citizens of the Federation carry out the most effective and direct supervision. Sulu, don't worry that the Federation government will become a military government. We will welcome a brand new, real elected government. Pabre withdrew his gaze and looked calmly at the silent Sulu. He said, "You have contributed to the Federation. I don't want to give you any unfair treatment. I only hope that you can calm down, stand on the highest level, and consider the interests of the people of the Federation. I know that this sounds like a utopia that only exists in people's fantasies, but the ideal has never been so close to reality as it is today. This is the Federation's best chance. We are idealists, liberals, pragmatists. No, we are all people who insist on what is right and fight to the end." President Pabre looked at Sulu and said in a low voice, "We are all the same in our bones. We are just a stinky and hard rock from Donglin." The president raised his right arm and pointed at Li Jiedu and Du Xiaoqing beside him. His calm and infectious gaze pierced through the invisible wall and fell on Suli's face. "Join us, Sulu. Has that day really come? No, will that day really come?" Sulu listened in silence and subconsciously thought about it. He did not voice his doubts. He suddenly felt that his brain could not wrap itself around it. So, the person who killed Macklin and the people he hated were the same kind of people deep down in their bones? But how could Macklin be equated with that tiger? "On your path, many people who have died are innocent," he said with a frown and a slightly hoarse voice. "This is not right." "There is never perfect justice in the world," President Pabre said quietly. "For a long-term goal, there will always be people who need to sacrifice." Sulu silently recalled Professor Shun's words in his heart. There was never any reason in the universe, so he asked, "Then why is it not you or me who sacrificed?" President Pabre was silent for a moment and then said, "Schiller once wrote a legendary novel in his early years. The novel described a war that surrounded Xiangqing. In his later years, he wrote another novel, The Story of the Soldier, which described the innocent people who were used as shields by the hero during the war. The soldier's death saved the hero of Xiangqing and indirectly saved hundreds of thousands of people. However, to him it was such a tragedy. I think this story can answer your previous question. I have read this story. In my opinion, the soldier's death was not a sacrifice because no one asked for his opinion. That is the source of the tragedy." Sulu narrowed his eyes and said, "Similarly, you did not ask the waitress in the Linhai State Gymnasium whether the soldiers of the West Woods on the ancient bell were willing to die for your grand plan. So this is not a sacrifice. It is still murder." Then, in the Golden Foundation building, those special task force agents who died under the guns of you and Shi Qinghai, should they be considered as sacrifices, or were they murdered by you? President Pabre's eyes suddenly became extremely sharp, and the pressure was enough to stare into Suli's eyes. He asked in a deep voice. If those innocent special task force agents can be sacrificed in your eyes, then why can't Zhong Suahu and the others be sacrificed for the Federation? This was a very sharp and direct interrogation. Sulu narrowed his eyes and suddenly contracted his pupils. After a long silence, he tightly pursed his lips and looked up. He said, "A few years ago on the Iron Tower, I once said to a girl that the justice that needs to be obtained by sacrificing innocent people is not justice. Then what is the difference between us and you? The difference is that Shi Qinghai and I have never had the subjective intention to harm innocent people, including those special task force agents in the Golden Foundation building. Maybe this sounds like sophistry to you, because whether there is subjective intention or not, the result is the same death. But, just like what I thought in the Snow Queen Charter Square, I always insist that the motive is more important than the result." You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.